My name is Alina Henry. I am 28 years old, and for a decade, my parents treated my signature as a blank check to erase my older brother's catastrophic mistakes. Yesterday, during the final match of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, my father slid a familiar legal document across his mahogany desk, expecting me to sign away my trust distribution for the third time to save his golden child from ruin. But when I pushed that silver pen back across the wood and told him no, the calculating composure drained from his face, replaced by a fear I had never seen before. Before I tell you what happened when I finally defied the Henry shipping empire, if you enjoy stories of shifting family dynamics and corporate justice, take a second to subscribe to Edana Told Stories. How old are you? And have you ever been forced to be the shock absorber for a toxic relative? Drop a comment and let me know. To understand why that single refusal detonated our family facade, I need to bring you into the stifling quiet of my father's private study. Outside on the heated terrace of our Anchorage estate, 200 maritime executives and politicians roared at a wall-sized television screen. The Alaskan July air carried a sharp chill, but inside the study, the atmosphere was suffocating. My father, Richard Henry, sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of reclaimed timber. He did not look toward the terrace. His attention remained fixed on the thick sheet of paper resting between us. With a subtle push of his index finger, he sent a silver pen sliding across the polished surface. The metal barrel stopped 2 inches from my hand. "Sign it, Alina," he said. His voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it carried the practiced authority of a man who controlled half the freight moving through the Gulf of Alaska. Let us return to our guests. I stared at the pen. On paper, I was the senior risk analyst for Henry Freight. My actual job was anticipating supply chain disruptions. My unspoken mandatory role in the family was serving as the financial safety net. Every 4 years, coinciding with this global tournament, my father summoned me to this exact room. The ritual never changed. He would deliver a patronizing speech about unified corporate strategy, followed by a proxy agreement that quietly transferred my dividends into a designated corporate account. The money never stayed in the company. It flowed straight into the sinking craters of my older brother Julian's failed ventures. If I picked up that pen, Julian's mounting debts would vanish. The Henry name would remain pristine, and I would return to my cubicle on Monday morning as if I had not just subsidized my brother's incompetence for the 3rd time in my adult life. A sudden cheer erupted from the terrace. The bass of the sports broadcast rattled the heavy window panes. I let the silence stretch. I looked at my father's hands, manicured and steady, resting on the desk. Then I looked at the proxy agreement. The phrasing was sterile, drafted to look like a voluntary reallocation of shareholder assets. I felt the conditioned urge to reach out. It was the path of least resistance, the role I had been groomed to play since childhood. Instead, I placed my index finger on the center of the document. I applied just enough pressure to gain traction, then pushed it back across the mahogany. The paper whispered against the wood, coming to rest directly in front of him. "No," I said. My father's gaze snapped up from the desk. The paternal mask fractured. The air in the room seemed to thin out. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone carrying a sharp edge. "I am not signing it, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice as level as a sheet of ice. "I am done funding Julian's mistakes." Outside, the crowd erupted into another deafening roar. Inside, the foundation of the Henry family began to crumble. The heavy oak door of the study swung open before my father could formulate a response. Julian strode into the room, bringing the scent of expensive cigars and the dull roar of the soccer match with him. My older brother wore his title of Chief Strategy Officer like a tailored suit, projecting an aura of earned success that hid a profound lack of actual competence. He glanced at the proxy agreement still resting in front of our father, then at my empty hands. His handsome features tightened. He did not ask what was happening. He already knew. For a man who rarely read a quarterly report, Julian possessed a predator's instinct for when his financial lifelines were being threatened. "Are we delaying the celebration for a reason?" Julian asked, his tone clipped. The European investors are asking where the hosts went. She refuses to sign, my father said. Julian turned to me. A rigid smile stretched across his face, the kind he reserved for difficult board members and skeptical journalists. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of his cologne became stifling, masking the faint smell of alcohol on his breath. "Stop playing games, Alina. We have guests. Pick up the pen." I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the cool fabric of my trousers beneath my palms. "I am not playing anything, Julian. The proxy is dead. I am done." I expected him to argue logistics. I expected him to promise repayment, to offer some hollow equity in his latest shell company, just to pacify me. Instead, his eyes darkened. He realized private coercion was failing, so he pivoted to a tactic he had perfected since we were teenagers. He chose public destruction. Julian snatched the unsigned document from the desk, turned on his heel, and walked straight out the French doors onto the crowded terrace. The cold Alaskan wind swept into the study, carrying the sharp tang of the ocean and the scent of grilled cedar. I followed him out, stepping into the glaring afternoon sun. 200 pairs of eyes shifted from the giant television screens to the heir apparent of Henry Freight. Julian held the paper up, his voice projecting across the patio, easily cutting through the ambient noise of the party. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption," Julian announced, wearing an expression of practiced, weary sorrow. "It seems my little sister is having an episode. We might need a medic on standby." The cheers died in throats. Conversations halted mid-sentence. State senators, union bosses, and maritime tycoons turned their heads. I stood at the threshold of the study, exposed to the sudden, piercing scrutiny of Anchorage's elite. She is refusing routine corporate protocols. Julian continued stepping toward the center of the crowd, making himself the focal point of the drama. "You all know how hard she works in the back office. The stress of the analyst desk is clearly causing a hysterical breakdown. She is screaming about conspiracies and jealousy. We just wanted to secure the family trust, but she is trying to tear this company apart over a delusion." My chest constricted. The air left my lungs. 28 years of ingrained conditioning crashed over me like a tidal wave. In my family, obedience was the only currency that bought peace. When Julian threw tantrums in high school, I was the one sent to apologize to the neighbors. When he wrecked his first sports car, my college fund paid the quiet settlement. The urge to shrink, to lower my gaze, to apologize and beg for the pen so I could make the stares stop, burned in my throat. My hands trembled at my sides. I wanted to disappear into the slate-gray paving stones beneath my feet. But then I looked at his left wrist. Julian stood tall, projecting total control, yet his right hand reached across his body. His thumb and forefinger pinched the bezel of his platinum Rolex, twisting it back and forth on his wrist. Twist, release. Twist, release. The frantic, rhythmic motion shattered the illusion of his confidence. My mind, trained to spot anomalies in endless columns of shipping data, locked onto that gesture. It was a childhood tell. At 7 years old, he twisted his watch when he broke a window and blamed the housekeeper. At 22, he twisted it when he begged our father to cover a bad commodities trade. He only touched the watch when he was drowning. My photographic memory for corporate ledgers engaged, cutting through the rising panic. I visualized the quarterly balance sheets I had reviewed last Tuesday. The discrepancies I had flagged and been told to ignore suddenly aligned in my head. The offshore routing numbers, the highly leveraged loans taken against our empty container yards in Seattle. Julian was not just over budget. He was facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The proxy signature was not meant to fund a new venture. It was required to cover a margin call. And based on the sheer terror radiating from that twisting watch bezel, the banks were coming to collect on Monday morning. He was not humiliating me out of spite. He was doing it out of primal, desperate fear. The realization grounded me. My hand stopped shaking. I lifted my chin and met his gaze across the terrace. I did not yell. I did not defend myself to the crowd. I just let him see that I understood exactly how close he was to the edge of the cliff. Julian saw the shift in my expression. His twisting fingers froze. The bravado faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by naked panic. Before he could speak again, the sharp click of high heels sounded on the stone patio. My mother, Victoria Henry, glided through the parted crowd. She wore a tailored ivory suit and an expression of profound maternal tragedy. She reached Julian, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder to physically align herself with the golden child. "Oh, Alina," my mother sighed. Her voice was pitched perfectly to reach the surrounding guests, dripping with fake sympathy. "We have pushed you too hard. Your father and I warned you that the risk department was too demanding for your constitution." She turned her gaze to the crowd, offering a brave, sad smile. "Please forgive this disruption. Family is so complicated when mental health is involved." I stared at the woman who had spent my entire life trading my dignity for her country club reputation. She was wrapping my financial boundary in the language of a psychiatric crisis, ensuring that every executive on this terrace would view me as an unstable liability. "Mother," I said, my voice steady, "you know exactly why I am refusing." Victoria's eyes hardened flat and dark, like frozen soil, even as her lips maintained the sorrowful pout. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers twice. 3 security guards in dark suits immediately stepped from the perimeter of the terrace. "Escort my daughter to her car," Victoria commanded. "She needs to rest. Do not let her back inside the house. She is clearly a danger to herself and the company right now." The guards moved in. 2 of them flanked me, their sheer physical size forcing me to step backward. The guests stepped aside, clearing a path. People I had drafted contracts for, people whose supply chains I had saved during the winter freeze, now averted their eyes. I was being paraded off my own family's property like a trespasser. They were severing me from the industry network I had spent a decade building. By Monday, the rumors of my hysterical breakdown would reach every boardroom in Alaska. My career at Henry Freight was effectively over. The guards guided me down the sweeping front steps of the estate. The heavy iron gates loomed ahead, separating the manicured grounds from the dense, pine-lined road. The conflict had shifted from a private coercion in a quiet study to a public execution of my professional character. My family had drawn the battle lines, assuming I would retreat into silence as I always did. They did not realize they had just given me nothing left to lose. As the security detail pushed me toward the gravel driveway, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps approaching from the shadows of the pine trees, signaling that the real corporate war was about to begin. The security detail marched me to the edge of the property, their heavy boots crushing the frosted gravel beneath our feet. They did not speak a single word. They did not need to. Their broad shoulders and rigid postures communicated my new status with perfect clarity. I was in exile. The towering wrought iron gates of the Henry estate clicked shut behind me, the metallic latch echoing sharply in the crisp July evening. I stood alone on the perimeter road, shivering in my thin silk blouse, watching the warm golden light spilling from the floor-to-ceiling windows of my childhood home. Inside that sprawling house, my father was likely pouring apologies, and expensive scotch, for the restless investors. My mother was surely spinning a tragic, sympathetic narrative about my mental fragility to the state senators. Julian was undoubtedly pacing the study, calculating how to survive the impending financial ruin without my signature to save him. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, feeling the biting wind rolling off the Gulf of Alaska. The physical cold was nothing compared to the profound, hollow chill settling into my stomach. A rhythmic crunching sound broke the stillness of the private road. Someone was walking down the sweeping driveway toward the gates. The figure moved with a fluid, deliberate grace, bypassing the sweeping arcs of the security cameras by sticking closely to the deep shadows cast by the tall pine hedges. As the person stepped into the dim, amber glow of the street lamp, my breath caught. It was Maya. My brother's wife wore a striking emerald green trench coat that contrasted beautifully with her deep brown skin. Before marrying into our toxic family hierarchy, Maya had been a formidable senior strategist at a premier consulting firm in Chicago. Julian had pursued her relentlessly, presenting her to our parents as the ultimate modern corporate partner. But the Henrys never actually wanted a brilliant strategist in the family. They wanted a polished public relations asset, a beautiful woman to stand silently beside Julian at charity galas and soften his ruthless, reckless image. Maya reached the iron gate. She did not ask the security guards in the nearby booth to open it. Instead, she slipped sideways through the narrow, unmonitored pedestrian turnstile, carrying 2 steaming paper cups in her gloved hands. For a brief moment, the perspective of the evening belonged entirely to her. Maya maintained a placid, supportive smile whenever she was in the presence of my parents, but beneath that flawless mask burned a quiet, calculated fury. She despised the Henry family. She despised my mother's condescending remarks, disguised as high society etiquette. Most of all, she despised Julian. She knew about the frequent, unexplained late-night hotel charges on his private credit cards. She knew about his disastrous gambling, disguised as venture capital investments. Maya had spent 3 years trapped in a gilded cage, bound by an airtight prenuptial agreement drafted by my father's ruthless legal team. The contract dictated she would walk away with 0 assets and a ruined professional reputation if she initiated a divorce without legally irrefutable cause. She was a prisoner of her own marriage, forced to play the devoted wife while her husband squandered their future. Maya stopped a few feet away from me. She reached up and rubbed her cheek with the back of her coat sleeve. A faint smear of crimson transferred to the dark green fabric. It was my mother's signature shade of lipstick, left behind from a forced theatrical kiss on the cheek just moments ago. Maya stared at the stain with profound disgust, taking a long, steadying breath to compose herself. She held out one of the paper cups. "Black, with 2 sugars," she said, her voice smooth and pitched low to avoid carrying in the wind. I took the coffee. The intense heat seeped through the thin cardboard, thawing my numb fingers. "Thank you," I murmured, keeping my eyes on the security booth. "Are they sending you out here to negotiate a peaceful surrender?" Maya let out a short, hollow laugh that held no humor. "Julian is currently hiding in your father's study, downing single malt scotch and sweating through his designer shirt. Victoria is telling the governor that you need a wellness retreat in Switzerland to recover from burnout. They think you are temporarily broken, Alina. They assume you will show up at the headquarters on Monday morning, beg for forgiveness, and sign the proxy to save your job." I took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat ground me. "I am never signing that paper." "Good," Maya said, stepping closer until our shoulders nearly touched. "Because if you had picked up that pen today, you would have signed your own death warrant." I frowned, lowering the cup. "What do you mean? It was just a dividend transfer." "It was extortion, but I have done it 3 times before." Maya glanced back at the iron gate, ensuring the guards remained inside their heated booth. She reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat and retrieved a small, heavy, metallic object. She pressed it firmly into my free hand, curling my fingers around it. It was a locked, encrypted flash drive. "Julian is not just dealing with a standard margin call," Alina Maya whispered, keeping her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead, pretending we were merely having a casual conversation about the cold. "His new logistics venture in the Cayman Islands is a toxic shell. He leveraged it using company assets, but he structured the entire holding company under a separate tax identification number to hide the liability from the board of directors." My risk analyst instincts flared to life, piercing through my lingering shock. "Whose number did he use?" "Yours," Maya stated flatly. The wind howled through the pine branches, but the true cold originated deep within my own chest. The puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind, forming a terrifying picture. "He used your previous proxy signatures to establish you as the primary guarantor for the offshore debt." Maya continued, her tone clinical and precise. "The document your father pushed across the desk today was not a simple dividend transfer. It contained deeply buried clauses acknowledging your full legal ownership of the Cayman venture. If you had signed it, the bank would not just take your trust fund on Monday morning. They would seize everything you own. You would absorb millions in illegal, highly leveraged debt." Julian was not just asking for a financial bailout. He was framing you for the collapse. My breathing hitched. Financial manipulation was a family tradition, but this was a staggering criminal escalation. My father and brother were actively constructing a legal snare designed to drop federal fraud charges squarely onto my shoulders. They were entirely willing to sacrifice my freedom, my career, and my future to preserve Julian's inheritance and the company's stock price. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, tightening my grip on the small metal drive until it dug painfully into my palm. "If Julian goes down for fraud, your comfortable lifestyle goes down with him." Maya turned to face me. Her dark eyes reflected the amber light of the street lamp, burning with an intense, patient intelligence. "My lifestyle is a prison, Alina. Julian's prenup prevents me from accessing any verified financial data or challenging him in court without forfeiting my fundamental rights. I cannot initiate the strike. If I take these raw files to the authorities, his corporate lawyers will bury me in litigation until I am bankrupt. I need someone on the inside. I need someone on the board of directors to detonate the charge." She pointed a manicured finger at the drive in my hand. "That contains the offshore routing numbers, the Cayman registration documents, and Julian's internal emails. It is the exact ammunition you need to dismantle him. But the encryption is military grade. I cannot bypass the security walls on my own. You need my compliance scraper." I realized the technical pathway already forming in my head. "I need the brilliant analyst who built the compliance scraper," Maya corrected. "We are both trapped by the Henry men, Alina. They abuse you because they think you are too loyal to ever fight back. They ignore me because they think I am just a pretty, silent accessory. It is time we show them what happens when the women they constantly underestimate decide to stop playing by their rigged rules." A silent, lethal alliance forged itself in the freezing Alaskan night. Maya could not strike openly, but she had risked everything to secure the weapon. I possessed the technical capability and the corporate system access to pull the trigger. We stood together on the gravel road, two outcasts united by a shared, burning desire to dismantle the toxic hierarchy that had fed on us for years. Maya checked her phone, the screen casting a pale glow across her striking features. "I have to get back inside before Victoria realizes I am missing and sends security to find me. Take the drive. Go home. Decrypt the files." I slipped the flash drive deep into my coat pocket, feeling its heavy promise. "Thank you, Maya. I will not waste this." She offered a tight, genuine smile, but her eyes remained serious. "Do not thank me yet. Prepare yourself for Monday morning. Richard and Julianne know you are a legitimate threat now. When you walk into the headquarters, they will not just fire you. They are going to try to erase you from the industry." Maya turned and walked back through the pedestrian gate, her emerald coat dissolving into the deep shadows of the estate. I stood alone on the frosted gravel, listening to the distant cheers of the party guests inside. The paralyzing fear that had gripped me on the terrace was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. My family had spent my entire life teaching me how to manage corporate risk. It was time to show them I had finally learned how to become one. The drive into downtown Anchorage on Monday morning felt like crossing a frozen wasteland. A thick layer of coastal fog clung to the city streets, muting the morning traffic and wrapping the steel skyscrapers in a dense gray shroud. I steered my practical sedan into the underground parking garage of the Henry Freight and Logistics headquarters, finding my reserved spot near the elevator bank. My pulse drummed a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew my father and brother would retaliate after the public spectacle on the terrace. I anticipated a hostile meeting, a temporary suspension, or perhaps a screaming match behind closed boardroom doors. I did not expect the sheer, coordinated scale of their swift execution. I walked into the expansive glass lobby, pulling my corporate keycard from my blazer pocket. The polished granite floors echoed with the sharp clicks of my heels. I approached the electronic security turnstiles, a barrier I had crossed every single weekday for 6 years. I pressed my badge against the scanner. Instead of the familiar green chime, the device emitted a harsh, flat red buzz. "Access denied" flashed across the small digital screen. I tried again. Red buzz. "Access denied." Is the system down? I asked, turning toward the main security desk. Marcus, a retired police officer who had worked the front desk since I was an intern, refused to meet my eyes. He stared intensely at his computer monitor, his jaw tight. He did not offer his usual warm morning greeting. Instead, he reached beneath his tall counter and hoisted a medium-sized cardboard box onto the marble surface. "I am sorry, Miss Alina," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable murmur. "Building management deactivated your credentials at midnight. Mr. Henry left instructions that you are not permitted past the lobby." I stared at the cardboard box. Sticking out of the top flap was my favorite ceramic coffee mug, the framed photograph of my grandfather standing on his first cargo ship, and a handful of specialized supply chain reference books. They had packed up my office. In the span of 36 hours, my father had sent a crew into my private workspace, stripped it of my existence, and dumped the remnants at the front door like garbage. "There is an envelope for you," Marcus added, gesturing to a thick, cream-colored package resting on top of my books. "Human Resources said you need to read it immediately." I picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy embossed with the sharp crest of our external legal counsel. I did not open it in the lobby. I could feel the stares of junior analysts and logistics coordinators as they filed through the turnstiles, whispering and pointing. I gathered the heavy cardboard box in my arms, turned my back on the empire I had helped optimize, and walked out into the freezing Alaskan wind. I reached my car and dumped the box onto the passenger seat. The framed photo of my grandfather tipped over the glass, tapping against the plastic dashboard. I sat in the driver's seat, leaving the engine off, letting the cold seep through the thin fabric of my coat. My breath plumed in the frigid cabin air as I tore open the legal seal. The document was a masterpiece of corporate assassination. It was a formal notice of termination, pending an internal investigation for gross negligence, erratic workplace behavior, and unverified financial mismanagement. The letter demanded my immediate resignation from the firm. Furthermore, it demanded the voluntary surrender of my 5% equity stake in the family trust. If I signed the enclosed waiver, they offered a severance package of $50,000 and a neutral reference. If I refused, the family lawyers promised to file a public injunction by Friday. They threatened to release fabricated evidence of my supposed hysterical breakdown to every major shipping publication in the Pacific Northwest, effectively blacklisting my name across the entire industry. A wave of intense vertigo crashed over me. The text on the page blurred. The psychological terror of the moment seized my lungs, stealing my oxygen. This company was my entire identity. After graduating top of my university class, I had not spent my 20s taking luxury ski trips to Aspen like Julian. I had worked 80-hour weeks analyzing volatile shipping routes, predicting winter supply chain disruptions, and saving Henry Freight millions in operational costs. I had done it all to prove my worth to a father who only saw me as a walking checkbook. Now, with the stroke of a pen, they were erasing my career, my income, and my professional reputation. I dropped the papers onto my lap and leaned my head back against the headrest. The cabin of the car felt like a shrinking cage. The internal conflict tore at my resolve, whispering insidious, familiar commands. "Just surrender," a small, conditioned voice echoed in my mind. It would be so easy to give up. I could sign the waiver right now. I could take the meager $50,000, pack up my apartment, and drive down to Seattle. I could find a quiet, unglamorous job at a mid-level logistics firm. I could disappear into a normal life, forever avoiding the agonizing public war my family was preparing to wage against me. My parents had spent 28 years training me to back down. They knew exactly how to trigger my fear of confrontation. They were counting on my silence. They expected me to flee. I turned my head and stared through the fogged windshield at the towering glass facade of the corporate monolith. On the 20th floor, in the expansive corner suite, my father was likely drinking his morning coffee, congratulating Julian on a swift, painless victory. They thought they had amputated the infected limb. They believed they had silenced the only witness to their impending financial ruin. Walking away meant survival. But as I sat in the freezing car, the profound cost of that survival settled into my bones. If I surrendered, Julian would use my stolen equity to temporarily plug the holes in his Cayman Islands disaster. When the federal auditors eventually uncovered the pension embezzlement, my parents would use my signed resignation as proof of my guilt. They would frame me from afar, and I would spend my quiet new life fighting federal prison time. Furthermore, running away meant abandoning Maya. It meant leaving the only person who had risked her own safety to hand me the weapon I needed. It meant watching my grandfather's proud, honest legacy be dismantled by two men who lacked a fraction of his courage. I looked down at my hands. They rested on the top arc of the dark leather steering wheel. They were shaking. Fine tremors of residual panic and pure adrenaline vibrated through my fingertips. I watched them tremble for a long moment. Then slowly, the shaking began to subside. My fingers curled inward, gripping the cold leather. I squeezed until my knuckles turned stark, unnatural white against the dark material. The suffocating fear evaporated, pushed out by a rising, crystalline wave of absolute rage. My father and brother had mistaken my decade of quiet diligence for weakness. They had isolated me, locked me out of the building, and threatened to destroy my name. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. By stripping away my job, my office, and my role as the dutiful daughter, they had stripped away every single reason I had left to protect them. The retreat was officially over. I picked up my phone, bypassed the standard company network, and opened a secure encrypted browser window. I needed a quiet place with flawless internet to unleash the digital scraper, and I needed an attorney who hated the Henry family just as much as I did. The counteroffensive had begun, and I was going to burn their fabricated narrative to the ground. I drove away from the towering glass perimeter of the downtown financial district, steering my sedan toward a nondescript strip mall on the southern edge of Anchorage. The corporate coffee houses near the headquarters were crawling with junior executives and loose-lipped interns. I needed anonymity. I parked outside an independent diner that smelled of burnt toast and bitter drip roast, pulling my laptop bag from the passenger seat. The bell above the door chimed a dull greeting as I walked inside. I chose a booth tucked deep in the back corner, facing the entrance, shielded by a cracked vinyl partition. A tired waitress dropped a thick ceramic mug of black coffee onto the Formica table. I nodded my thanks, waiting until she retreated behind the counter before pulling my computer from its padded sleeve. My hands were steady now, the earlier tremors replaced by a cold, calculating precision. My father and Julian believed they had severed my connection to the company mainframe when they deactivated my security badge and locked my office. They assumed the corporate firewall was an impenetrable fortress. They forgot who built the ventilation system. Years ago, during my first promotion within the risk department, I designed an automated compliance auditing scraper. It was a sophisticated piece of code meant to monitor international tariff fluctuations and flag financial anomalies across our global shipping routes. Because the program required immense processing power, I hosted it on an independent leased server down in Seattle, completely bypassing the local Anchorage IT grid. My father never understood the technical architecture of his own empire. He merely saw the profit margins the scraper protected. Consequently, he never knew to revoke my administrative access to the Seattle server. I connected my laptop to the diner Wi-Fi, routing my signal through a double-encrypted virtual private network. The familiar black command terminal popped onto my screen. I typed in the backdoor credentials, holding my breath. A string of green text cascaded down the monitor. Access granted. I was inside the ghost architecture of Henry Freight. Reaching into my coat pocket, I withdrew the heavy metallic flash drive Maya had surrendered in the freezing driveway. I plugged it into the USB port. A password prompt immediately blocked my path. Maya had warned me the encryption was military grade, designed to stonewall corporate spies and rival logistics firms. But I did not need to guess Julian's password. I just needed to feed the encrypted files into my compliance scraper and let the raw processing power of the Seattle server tear the digital locks apart. I initiated the decryption sequence. A slow, agonizing progress bar appeared on the screen, calculating the time required to break the cipher. As the percentage ticked upward, the rhythmic, high-pitched hum of my laptop cooling fan began to fill the quiet booth. The sound became a metronome, ticking away the final moments of my ignorance. I stared at the scrolling lines of code, but my vision softened, blurring the harsh neon lights of the diner. The scent of stale coffee faded, replaced by the sharp, stinging aroma of diesel fuel and raw sea salt. My mind drifted backward 20 years into the past, anchoring itself on the icy docks of the Whittier port. I was 10 years old, bundled in a thick woolen parka, standing beside my grandfather, Alina Henry. He was a man carved from Alaskan granite, the original founder of our shipping empire. Unlike my father, who preferred the sterile climate of a corner office, my grandfather spent his days on the cargo ships, his hands calloused from hauling frozen mooring lines. He had hoisted me onto a stack of wooden shipping pallets that afternoon, shielding me from the biting coastal wind with his broad frame. In his gloved hands, he held a massive, leather-bound physical ledger. The pages were yellowed, filled with neat, handwritten columns of black ink. Look closely at the numbers, Alina, his deep, resonant voice echoed in my memory, cutting through the screeching of the seagulls overhead. The mathematics of this business will never lie to you. Men will construct beautiful fables. They will smile and shake your hand while attempting to pick your pocket. But a ledger is a sacred promise. It shows you the honest soul of the operation. You protect the numbers, and the numbers will protect the crew. The memory tasted bitter on my tongue. Elias built his fortune through grueling, honest labor, viewing his employees as an extended family. He knew the name of every dock worker and mechanic on the payroll. When he passed away, Richard inherited the throne immediately, replacing my grandfather's rugged honor with a sterile, manicured greed. To my father and brother, numbers were not a promise. They were a weapon used to manipulate stock prices, secure lavish personal loans, and fund a lifestyle devoid of actual consequence. The laptop fan whined louder, pulling me back to the present. The progress bar hit 100%. My erratic heartbeat pounded against my ribs, matching the frantic whirring of the computer hardware. The encryption shattered. A dozen digital folders burst open across my screen, spilling their secrets into the light. I opened the primary spreadsheet Maya had flagged, leaning closer to the monitor. The initial figures were staggering. Julian had funneled nearly $40 million into his Cayman Islands shell company over the past 18 months. The offshore venture was a black hole, hemorrhaging cash on leveraged derivative bets and catastrophic currency shorts. My brother was not just struggling, he was presiding over a historic financial implosion. But the sheer volume of the debt was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the source of the capital. I minimized the offshore spreadsheet and brought up the raw corporate outflow data from my compliance scraper. I began cross-referencing the dates and the routing numbers, tracing the money backward from the Caribbean bank accounts to its origin point in Anchorage. Henry Freight possessed a massive operational budget, but $40 million in liquid cash could not simply vanish from our operational profit margins without triggering immediate alarms from our external auditors. The money had to come from a blind spot. It had to originate from an account that operated outside the standard quarterly review cycle. My eyes scanned the matched routing numbers. The cursor hovered over a specific alphanumeric sequence. Account 884-Bravo. The breath escaped my lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. Account 884-Bravo was not an operational holding fund. It was the Employee Pension Trust. My father and Julian were not merely borrowing against our shipping containers or real estate assets. They were systematically draining the retirement savings of the very people my grandfather had sworn to protect. They were stealing from the warehouse foreman, the long-haul drivers, and Marcus, the security guard. It was a betrayal so profound, so devastating in its scope, that it defied simple family drama. This was federal embezzlement. A chilling realization washed over me, cold and paralyzing. The federal government heavily monitored corporate pension funds. Moving $40 million across international borders required multiple layers of ironclad executive authorization. Julian could not simply wire the money using his own credentials. The compliance algorithms would have locked the transfer instantly. He needed a clean, specialized signature from a risk management officer to bypass the security protocols. I opened the transaction history for the Cayman transfers. Attached to every single wire, appended as the primary authorizing guarantor, was a scanned digital signature. It was my signature. The floor beneath the diner booth seemed to drop away. I pulled up the metadata for the authorization forms. They were dated July 2018 and November 2022, the exact months of the previous World Cup tournaments. The exact dates I had sat in my father's mahogany study and signed those proxy documents under the guise of covering Julian's minor bad investments. My parents had not merely bullied me into parting with my trust dividends, they had weaponized my blind loyalty. They used the obscure legal clauses buried within those proxies to grant Julian unfettered, authorized access to the pension fund using my name. If the offshore venture had succeeded, Julian would have quietly repaid the pension, keeping the astronomical profits for himself. But the venture had failed spectacularly. The margin call was coming on Monday. When the bank seized the Cayman Shell Company, the federal auditors would immediately follow the money trail. They would find the drained pension accounts, and they would find my signature stamped on every single fraudulent wire transfer. My father's demand for a third signature yesterday was not about funding a new venture. He needed a fresh proxy to authorize a final, desperate transfer to cover the impending margin call and hide the theft for another quarter. When I refused, I inadvertently triggered the collapse of their entire scheme. I stared at the glowing screen, the magnitude of the trap closing around my throat. Richard and Victoria did not just fire me this morning to punish my disobedience. They fired me to complete the narrative. When the Department of Justice eventually raided the headquarters, my parents would present my sudden termination as proof that they had discovered my supposed rogue accounting. They were framing me to absorb the catastrophic fallout. Julian would walk away with a reprimand, and I would spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. I closed the laptop, severing the connection. The diner plunged back into mundane reality, the waitress wiping down the far counter, completely unaware that the woman sitting in the corner booth had just become the prime suspect in a massive federal crime. The rules of engagement had irrevocably changed. I was no longer fighting to save my job or to teach my family a lesson about boundaries. I was fighting for my freedom. My expertise in risk analysis told me exactly what I needed to survive the incoming storm. I needed to move faster than my father's legal team, and I needed an attorney who specialized in corporate slaughter. I pulled out my phone, dialing a Seattle area code, preparing to summon the most ruthless litigator I knew. I closed my laptop, severing the connection to the Seattle server, but the digital footprint had already been left behind. My phone buzzed against the laminate table of the coffee shop. It was an automated security alert from the compliance scraper. Someone inside the Henry Freight Information Technology Department had noticed the firewall anomaly. Julian was monitoring the network architecture, and my intrusion had triggered his digital tripwires. He knew I possessed the Cayman Islands routing numbers. He knew I held the proof of the stolen pension funds. 10 minutes later, a formal calendar invitation materialized in my corporate email inbox, sent directly to my mobile device. The sender was the executive secretary. The subject line read, "Emergency Shareholder Meeting." The date was set for this coming Friday, 8 in the morning. The attached agenda listed a single primary objective. The board would discuss the immediate restructuring of the risk management division and the presentation of internal findings regarding severe financial irregularities. Julian and my father were accelerating their timeline. They intended to formally vote on my guilt, locking their fabricated narrative into the official corporate record, just in time to offer me up to the federal authorities before the banks opened on Monday. I needed an architect for the impending war. I left a crumpled bill on the diner table, walked out to my freezing car, and dialed a Seattle area code. Harrison Thorne answered on the second ring. Harrison was a ruthless, independent corporate litigator who built his formidable reputation by dismantling dynastic family wealth across the Pacific Northwest. My father once tried to blackball his boutique firm from a lucrative maritime contract to secure a deal for a friend, a slight Harrison never forgave nor forgot. He owed the Henry family nothing. More importantly, he possessed an insatiable appetite for destroying arrogant chief executives. I explained the offshore accounts, the stolen pension funds, and the looming Friday deadline. Harrison told me to rent a secure room, pay in cash, and wait. He arrived in Anchorage on the last flight of the night. We met in a drab roadside motel on the industrial outskirts of the city, miles away from the upscale downtown hotels where my father kept informants on the payroll. The room smelled of stale bleach and cheap carpet cleaner. The heating unit rattled loudly beneath the single frost-covered window. Harrison walked through the door wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the peeling floral wallpaper. He did not offer a handshake or comforting platitudes. He simply dropped his coat on the bed, unzipped his leather briefcase, pulled out a secondary laptop, and demanded the encrypted flash drive. For 2 uninterrupted hours, the only sound in the room was the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. I sat on the edge of the mattress watching his eyes scan the decrypted spreadsheets. Harrison possessed a predatory calculating intelligence. He cross-referenced Julian's Cayman routing numbers with his own backdoor access to the state legal registry and the federal maritime databases. When he finally looked up from the glowing screen, his expression was carved from stone. "Your father is not just planning to fire you," Harrison said, his voice a low, raspy baritone that commanded the space. "I just pulled the blind drafts from their external legal counsel. They are preparing a sworn affidavit claiming you operated a rogue shadow ledger to fund a gambling addiction. They are pinning the entire $40 million deficit on your designated accounting errors. They will present this packet to the board on Friday, secure a vote of no confidence, and hand the dossier straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission." My stomach hollowed out. The clinical reality of federal prison loomed over me, casting a long, dark shadow over the shabby motel room. I looked down at my hands, feeling the treacherous sting of tears forming in the corners of my eyes. These were the people who raised me. They had tucked me into bed, paid for my university degree, and smiled in our holiday photographs. Now they were scripting my total destruction with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a corporate merger. Harrison watched my composure falter. He stood up, walked over to the wobbly motel nightstand, and picked up a glass of cheap, condensation-covered tap water. He stepped toward me and slid the glass across the scratched wooden table. The thick base bumped gently against my knuckles. "Drink this," Harrison instructed. "Stop grieving for a family that died a long time ago and start thinking like an assassin. The courtroom does not reward tears. It rewards evidence." The blunt, unsympathetic command worked. It severed the rising panic and grounded me in the present moment. I took a slow sip of the cold water, letting the chill clear the fog from my mind. The suffocating tension in the room relaxed slightly as we pivoted from shock to tangible strategy. Harrison began outlining the strict boundaries of modern corporate governance laws. We needed to find a structural weakness in the Henry Freight bylaws, a legal mechanism powerful enough to override a majority shareholder vote. We pulled up digital copies of the foundational corporate charter, searching for a shield. The fragile productive comms shattered when my phone chimed with an incoming multimedia message. The sender icon displayed the name Victoria. I tapped the screen. A high-resolution photograph loaded. It was an image of an old frayed leather dog collar with a tarnished brass tag resting on the pristine marble countertop of my mother's kitchen. The engraved name on the scratched brass tag read, Buster. Buster was my childhood golden retriever. When I was 12 years old, the dog developed a habit of barking during my mother's extravagant summer garden parties. One afternoon, I came home from middle school to find the house entirely silent. Victoria calmly informed me she had sent the dog to a distant farm because he was a loud, unmanageable liability to her social events. I spent 3 days searching the neighborhood, crying until my throat bled, but I never saw him again. Below the photograph, my mother had typed a single, venomous sentence. Some liabilities simply must be removed for the good of the household. It was a calculated, devastating psychological strike. Victoria knew my technical defenses were strong, so she bypassed the corporate battlefield and targeted my emotional foundation. She wanted to remind me of my ultimate powerlessness. She wanted to trigger the traumatized 12-year-old girl who could not even save her own pet. The remembered scent of Buster's fur and the haunting echo of that empty house rushed back, threatening to paralyze my analytical focus. My breathing grew shallow, the walls of the motel room pressing inward. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, measured breath. I pictured a heavy steel vault in my mind. I took the grief, the childhood betrayal, and the toxic maternal manipulation, placed them all inside the vault, and turned the heavy combination lock. I opened my eyes. The screen of my phone went dark. I was no longer the helpless child crying in an empty hallway. I was the senior risk analyst, and my mother had just revealed her own weakness. Her desperate need to taunt me proved she was terrified of what I might do next. She was trying to break my concentration because she knew I possessed the intellect to dismantle her empire. I placed the phone face down on the table. I turned back to Harrison, my voice stripped of all remaining hesitation. "They want to play governance games on Friday," I said, reaching for a stack of printed legal statutes. "Let us review the foundational charter again. I want to know every single rule my grandfather wrote when he incorporated this firm." We spent the remainder of the night and the entirety of the next morning buried in archaic corporate statutes. We ordered bitter black coffee from a local delivery service and analyzed every single clause, amendment, and loophole within the family trust structure. I compartmentalized the emotional warfare, channeling every ounce of my energy into constructing an airtight legal defense. Harrison challenged my interpretations, forcing me to defend my strategies against his brutal, simulated cross-examinations. If Julian and Richard wanted to use the boardroom as an execution chamber, I would ensure they were the ones standing squarely on the trap door. The emergency shareholder meeting was no longer a terrifying deadline for my demise. It was the designated coordinates for my ambush. The message arrived precisely at sunset. An email to my personal address contained a time and a location, the Knik Harbor Club. The text was brief, signed simply with the word, Dad. Harrison warned me it was a trap. He paced the shabby motel room, advising me to ignore the summons and focus on the corporate bylaws. I declined his advice. I needed to look my father in the eye one last time before the impending boardroom slaughter. I needed to understand the true depth of his deception. The drive across Anchorage took 20 minutes. The Knik Harbor Club sat perched on a rocky bluff overlooking the freezing coastal waters. Inside, the atmosphere radiated exclusive warmth. The air smelled of seared scallops, melted butter, and expensive cedar smoke. I handed my coat to a silent attendant and walked into the main dining room. Dim amber lighting cast long shadows over the plush leather booths. I spotted Richard immediately. He sat in a secluded corner alcove shielded by heavy velvet drapes. He had orchestrated his appearance with theatrical precision. His impeccably tailored suit jacket was draped over the neighboring chair. His silk tie hung loose around his collar. He rubbed his temples, projecting the image of an exhausted, heartbroken patriarch carrying the weight of the world. I slid into the booth opposite him. He did not speak immediately. He gestured to the waiter, ordering a glass of sparkling water for me. A heavy crystal tumbler rested near his right hand, filled with amber scotch over a single spherical block of ice. "Alina," he began, his voice dropping into a soft, gravelly register. "Thank you for coming. I know the past 48 hours have been devastating." I kept my hands folded on my lap. "Devastating is a polite term for a coordinated assassination attempt," I replied, my tone deliberately flat. Richard winced, a flicker of manufactured pain crossing his features. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the white linen tablecloth. "Do not view Monday as an assassination," he pleaded. "View it as a necessary quarantine. I had to remove you from the building to protect the company infrastructure. The shareholders are circling. The compliance algorithms alerted the network administrators to your unauthorized access." He paused, letting out a long, ragged sigh. "Julian is sick, Alina. It is a compulsion. He started making leveraged bets on offshore shipping routes 3 years ago. The losses compounded, and his pride prevented him from seeking help. He borrowed from the pension trust, intending to replace the capital before the quarterly audits. He never intended to hurt anyone. He is your brother. He needs rehabilitation, not a prison cell." The narrative slowed, drawing me into the gravitational pull of his paternal performance. For a fleeting second, the image of my older brother as a terrified, desperate addict tugged at my deepest familial instincts. Richard painted a picture of a tragic misstep rather than calculated fraud. He spoke of our childhood vacations in Juneau, recalling how Julian used to hold my hand near the steep hiking trails. My father was weaving a tapestry of nostalgia and guilt designed to smother my logical defenses. "I want to end this war tonight," Richard said, his tone softening into a desperate plea. "I want my family intact. We can absorb the offshore deficit if we restructured the domestic logistics division, but we cannot survive a federal investigation. If you walk into that shareholder meeting tomorrow morning and present the encrypted files, the authorities will dismantle everything your grandfather built. The legacy will be ashes." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a long, thick envelope. He placed it carefully on the table and pushed it toward me. "Inside that envelope is a cashier check for $5 million, Richard whispered. "Alongside it is a standard non-disclosure agreement. You take the money, you sign the paper. You move to Seattle or Portland, start a brilliant new firm, and never look back. I will guide Julian into a private treatment facility. We handle the financial shortfall quietly. You get a fresh start, and the family name survives." I stared at the thick envelope. $5 million represented a lifetime of freedom. It meant escaping the crushing cold of Alaska, leaving the toxic corporate hierarchy behind, and building a sanctuary far away from their manipulation. It was the ultimate temptation, wrapped in the guise of paternal mercy. I lifted my gaze from the envelope to his face. I studied his expression, searching for a trace of genuine remorse. My eyes drifted downward, landing on the heavy crystal tumbler resting near his fingertips. The spherical ice cube inside the scotch was cracking. A network of tiny fractures spread through the frozen core, melting into the expensive liquor. The condensation dripped down the side of the glass, pooling onto a white paper coaster. The warmth of the room was diluting the drink, eroding the solid foundation beneath the surface. A sudden clarity pierced through the emotional fog. The warmth emanating from my father was just as engineered as the climate control inside this restaurant. I shifted my peripheral vision, scanning the dim dining room behind his shoulder. 2 tables away, obscured by a decorative brass pillar, a man sat alone, pretending to study a leather-bound wine menu. He wore a sharp gray suit and possessed the rigid posture of a seasoned litigator. It was Gregory Sterling, the lead defense attorney for Henry Freight. He was not eating, he was not drinking. He was monitoring our interaction with the intense focus of a sniper. The puzzle pieces clicked together, forming a chilling, flawless picture of their legal vulnerability. If Richard truly held the winning hand, he would never offer me a fortune. On Monday, they deactivated my security badge and threatened to release fabricated evidence of a hysterical breakdown. They drafted affidavits pinning the pension theft on my accounting errors. They called an emergency board meeting to formally seal my fate. They projected supreme, untouchable dominance. Yet here he sat, begging me to take $5 million and sign a non-disclosure agreement. The buyout was not an olive branch. It was a white flag disguised as a gift. It was a desperate confession that their framing attempt contained a fatal structural flaw. When Julian detected my unauthorized intrusion into the compliance scraper, they realized I possessed the encrypted Cayman routing numbers. They knew my digital footprint could trace the stolen funds past my forged proxy signatures directly back to personal devices they could not hide. Their entire narrative required me to remain silent and terrified. If I walked into that boardroom and contested their allegations with raw data, their fabricated story would disintegrate before the board could even cast a vote. They were terrified of me. The realization sent a surge of pure, icy adrenaline through my veins. The psychological shackles that had bound me to this man for nearly 3 decades simply snapped. He was not a benevolent patriarch trying to save his son. He was a cornered criminal attempting to bribe a witness. I did not shout. I did not throw the expensive drink in his face. I simply leaned back against the plush leather booth and smiled. It was a cold, calculating expression, devoid of any daughterly affection. "You are scared," I said, my voice carrying the crisp, sharp edge of a breaking glacier. Richard blinked. The manufactured exhaustion vanished, replaced by a rigid, guarded tension. He glanced nervously over his shoulder toward Gregory Sterling, confirming my suspicion. "Alina, please be reasonable. This is a generous compromise." "It is a bribe," I corrected, pushing the thick envelope back across the white linen tablecloth. It slid until it bumped against his melting scotch. "And it is incredibly insulting that you thought $5 million could purchase my silence after you tried to purchase my freedom. Alina, do not do this. You cannot win a public battle against this firm. We have the board. We have the narrative." "If you had the narrative, you would not be sitting in this booth," I replied, picking up my purse. "You called me here because your lawyers finally reviewed the digital trail and realized your frame job is full of holes. You need my signature on that non-disclosure agreement to seal the gaps. Julian is not a tragic addict requiring rehabilitation. He is a thief, and you are his accomplice." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my coat. Richard's face flushed with suppressed rage. His hands balled into tight fists on the table. "If you walk out that door, the offer vanishes," he hissed, dropping the paternal facade entirely. "Tomorrow morning, we will present the evidence of your gross negligence. We will ruin your reputation so thoroughly that you will never work in logistics again. The authorities will have a warrant for your arrest by noon. You are choosing your own funeral." I looked down at the man who had controlled my entire existence. I felt nothing but a profound, clinical pity. "I will see you in the boardroom, Dad. Try to get some sleep tonight. You are going to need it." I turned my back on the alcove, ignoring the silent glare of Gregory Sterling as I walked past his table. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the Knik Harbor Club and stepped out into the freezing Alaskan night. The coastal wind whipped across the parking lot, biting at my cheeks, but the frigid air felt exceptionally pure. I had survived the final emotional snare. The red herring had failed. As I climbed into my car to return to the shabby motel, my mind raced toward the ultimate legal counterstrike. If they wanted to use the foundational corporate structure to destroy me, I needed to dig deeper into the archives. I needed to find the hidden mechanism my grandfather left behind the ironclad claws that would turn their own empire against them. The drive back from the Knik Harbor Club felt profoundly different. The paralyzing fear was gone. I navigated the icy Anchorage streets, steering my car away from the industrial motel and heading straight for my downtown apartment. Harrison followed close behind in his rental sedan. I needed my physical records. When I unlocked my front door, the apartment felt like a neglected museum. The air was stale. I had not been back here since the public humiliation on the terrace. I walked past the pristine living room and headed straight for the spare bedroom. It served as a makeshift storage unit. Stacked in the far corner were 6 heavy cardboard boxes. When my grandfather Elias passed away, my father instantly digitized the entire corporate history. Richard hired a team of expensive attorneys from New York to convert decades of foundational trust documents into sleek, searchable electronic files. They wanted to modernize the shipping empire. They tossed the original paper archives into the dumpster behind the headquarters. I climbed into that dumpster in the pouring rain and salvaged every single box. Harrison stepped into the room, taking off his tailored suit jacket and draping it over a chair. He looked at the towering stack of cardboard. "Your father's legal team is arrogant," I told Harrison, pulling the first box onto the floor. "Gregory Sterling relies on keyword searches and digital summaries. He never reads the analog ink." Alina Henry did not trust computers. He built the foundational family trust in the 1970s using a manual typewriter and a notary public. If there is a structural defense mechanism protecting my shares, it will not be on a server. It will be buried in here. We sat on the hardwood floor and began the agonizing process of manual discovery. The hours bled together. We sifted through decades of faded shipping manifests, carbon copy payroll receipts, and obsolete cargo logs. The dust coated my fingertips. The scent of old parchment and dried binding glue filled the small room, a sharp contrast to the sterile digital warfare we had been waging all week. It was nearing 3 a.m. when Harrison paused. He was holding a thick, leather-bound folio tied with a brittle black ribbon. The cover bore the faded seal of a defunct maritime insurance syndicate. Alina, Harrison said, his raspy voice dropping an octave. "Look at this." I crawled over to his side of the room. He untied the ribbon and carefully opened the folio. Inside lay the original Articles of Incorporation for the overarching family trust, drafted in 1974. Attached to the back, functioning as an obscure addendum to the standard insurance charter, was a typed rider. The heading read, "Fiduciary Safeguard Clause." Harrison adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the typewritten paragraphs. His index finger traced the lines of text. The New York lawyers missed this entirely because it was filed under an outdated maritime insurance schedule. He murmured, his tone laced with raw disbelief. They probably assumed it was a dead policy and never scanned it into the modern corporate database. "What does it say?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Harrison looked up, a predatory grin forming on his face. "Your grandfather was a paranoid genius. He knew exactly what kind of man your father was." Elias embedded a dead man switch into the very bedrock of the company. Harrison handed the heavy document to me. I read the typewritten words. The legal phrasing was dense, but the intent was unmistakable. Elias had structured the family trust with a self-destruct mechanism designed to protect his workers. The clause dictated that if any acting executive or managing trustee committed a fraudulent act against the employee pension fund, their voting shares and equity rights were instantly nullified. But the brilliance of the clause lay in the penalty structure. The forfeited shares did not return to the company treasury. They did not trigger a shareholder vote. According to the foundational charter, the disgraced executive's entire equity stake transferred immediately and automatically to the remaining compliant trustee. "Which is you," Harrison stated, leaning back against the wall. "If we can prove Richard and Julian breached their fiduciary duty by tapping the retirement accounts, this analog piece of paper legally strips them of their power. You do not need to persuade the board of directors to fire them. You do not need to win a popularity contest against your father. The moment the fraud is evidenced, their shares evaporate. You become the sole majority owner of Henry Freight by default." The sheer gravity of the discovery settled over me. I looked down at the bottom of the yellowed parchment. There, rendered in bold blue ink, was my grandfather's signature, Elias Henry. The ink had faded over the decades, but the loops and sharp angles of his handwriting remained resolute. I reached out and gently traced the signature with my fingertip. The coarse texture of the old paper felt like a direct link to the past. Elias had foreseen this exact betrayal. He knew Richard lacked a moral compass. He built a silent, hidden trapdoor to ensure the workers would always be shielded from his son's greed. Drawing strength from that faded blue ink, the lingering guilt of defying my family vanished. Elias was giving me permission to tear the empire down in order to save it. There is a condition, Harrison cautioned, interrupting the quiet moment. The clause is specific. It cannot be triggered by mere accusation or internal suspicion. You must present irrefutable, sworn proof of the financial crime simultaneously to the active board of directors and the federal maritime regulators. It requires a nuclear strike, I summarized. Precisely, Harrison nodded. We walk into the shareholder meeting on Friday. We drop the evidence on the table. At that exact second, my paralegals in Seattle file the identical packet with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The trap snaps shut. Everywhere at once. They will have zero time to initiate a cover-up. But if our evidence is weak, they will countersue us for defamation, and you will go to prison. I thought about the digital files we had decrypted. We possessed the internal routing numbers. We had the compliance scraper logs showing the unauthorized transfers out of the pension trust. We knew the money was flowing to the Cayman Islands. But Richard and his lawyers were master illusionists. If I presented those numbers, Gregory Sterling would simply argue that Julian was the victim. He would claim I set up the offshore shell company using my proxy signature, stole the pension funds myself, and was now trying to frame my innocent brother. The compliance logs only showed the money leaving Alaska. They did not prove who was waiting to catch the cash in the Caribbean. We need the final piece of the puzzle, I said, staring at the leather folio. We need the destination proof. Harrison folded his arms. We need Julian's personal offshore bank statements. We need documents proving he is the sole beneficiary drawing from those Cayman accounts. Without them, the dead man's switch is useless. Julian would never leave those statements on a company's server. He kept his darkest secrets close to his chest. He stored them in his private home office, locked inside his personal safe. I could not breach that physical perimeter. The security at his estate was impenetrable. But someone else already lived inside the fortress. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket. My hands were steady. I opened the secure, encrypted messaging application I had downloaded earlier in the week. I typed a specific sequence of numbers, establishing a direct, untraceable connection. The screen illuminated the dark room. A single green icon indicated the recipient was online. I initiated the chat. Maya. I typed, my thumbs moving swiftly across the digital keyboard. I found the weapon, but I need the ammunition. 3 agonizing minutes passed in silence. The 3 small typing dots appeared on my screen, vanished, and then appeared again. What do you need? Her message read. Julian's offshore bank statements, I replied. They are the only way to prove he is the sole beneficiary of the stolen pension funds. They must be physical copies or original digital files from his personal home network. Without them, my father's lawyers will pin the entire Cayman debt on me. Another long pause stretched the tension in the room. I could picture Maya sitting in the dark, pristine living room of her gilded cage, calculating the sheer danger of my request. If Julian caught her rummaging through his private financial records, he would invoke the draconian penalty clauses of their prenuptial agreement. He would cast her out onto the street, with nothing framing her as a corporate spy. The response finally materialized on my screen. He is sleeping, Maya wrote. The safe is in the lower study. I will go in. The text sent a cold shiver down my spine. The Shadow Alliance was moving from silent cooperation into active espionage. Maya was stepping directly into the line of fire. If she failed, we would both face total ruin before the sun rose. I locked my phone, the screen fading to black, and prayed that the woman my brother consistently underestimated was about to become his ultimate downfall. The concrete walls of the subterranean parking garage amplified the low, rhythmic rumble of my idling engine. I sat in the driver's seat, staring through the fogged windshield at the dark, empty ramp leading up to the street level. It was 4 a.m. on Thursday. The emergency board meeting loomed just 28 hours away. The temperature in Anchorage had plummeted overnight, encasing the sleeping city in a brittle shell of frost. Plumes of thick white exhaust billowed from my tailpipe, wrapping the rear bumper in a dense, swirling mist. Headlights suddenly swept across the concrete pillars, cutting through the gloom. A sleek black SUV descended the ramp, its wide tires hissing against the damp pavement. The vehicle pulled into the vacant space directly beside mine. The engine cut off. The driver's side door opened, and Maya stepped out into the dim fluorescent light. She wore a dark wool coat, the thick collar pulled high against the biting chill. Her customary flawless composure showed microscopic cracks. Her breathing was shallow, visible in the freezing air. Her hands, devoid of her usual leather gloves, trembled slightly as she clutched a thick manila envelope to her chest. I stepped out of my car, the frigid atmosphere immediately biting at my exposed neck and wrists. Maya walked toward me. The exhaust from our vehicles framed us in the sterile, gray environment, like operatives plotting a localized treason. "Did you get them?" I asked, keeping my voice hushed. Maya pressed the envelope into my hands. It felt dense, heavy with the weight of Julianne's hidden financial architecture. She leaned her back against a concrete pillar, closing her eyes for a fleeting second. "I got the Cayman routing sheets," she replied, her tone vibrating with residual adrenaline. I breached the safe in the lower study. The combination was the date of his first corporate promotion. He is so hopelessly predictable. "But you took a long time," I noted, scanning the dark perimeter of the garage to ensure we were truly alone. "Harrison and I have been waiting in that motel for hours." Maya opened her eyes. The flickering street lamp cast deep, exhausted shadows across her sharp cheekbones. "I took a long time because he woke up," she said, her voice dropping into a tight, strained whisper. "He came downstairs to pour a drink. He caught me kneeling on the carpet with the steel vault wide open." My chest tightened. The thought of Julian cornering Maya in the isolated, silent wing of their sprawling estate sent a spike of pure dread through my veins. Julian lacked physical courage in a fair fight, but he possessed a ruthless, unpredictable temper whenever his authority faced a direct challenge. "What happened?" I pressed. Maya recounted the confrontation with chilling, clinical detachment. She described the sudden sharp click of the study door latch. Julian standing in the threshold, a crystal tumbler in his right hand, his eyes locking onto the illuminated digital keypad of the safe. She detailed the predatory shift in his posture as he realized she was accessing his private financial ecosystem. He did not yell. He walked slowly toward her, utilizing his height to corner her against the towering mahogany bookshelves. "He threatened me with the prenuptial agreement," Maya explained, her gaze fixed on the stained concrete floor. "He told me he would invoke the fidelity and trust clauses to void my spousal support. He promised to throw me out onto the street with only the clothes on my back. He said he would spend millions to ensure no reputable consulting firm in the Pacific Northwest would ever hire a corporate thief. He wanted to watch me break." "How did you escape the room?" I asked, gripping the envelope so tightly my knuckles ached. "I gave him exactly what he wanted," Maya said. She lifted her chin, and a cold, calculating brilliance reignited in her dark eyes. I cried. I collapsed onto the floor and begged for his forgiveness. I told him I was insecure, that I was searching the safe for evidence of another woman. I stroked his fragile ego, Alina. I let him feel dominant. I let him believe he had crushed my spirit and reinforced his total, unquestionable control. The sheer psychological endurance required to kneel before an abuser and fake submission was staggering. Maya had weaponized her own degradation to secure the ultimate tactical victory. While he was gloating, Maya continued, a razor-sharp smile curving her lips. While he was standing over me, lecturing me about loyalty and harsh consequences, he left his lower desk drawer unlocked. I was weeping into my hands, but I was also reaching blindly above my head. I pocketed his secondary ledger. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool coat and withdrew a small, black, leather-bound book. It was an analog record, a dark, twisted mirror of my grandfather's sacred shipping logs. Maya handed it to me. The cover felt rough and worn under my fingertips. The envelope contains the offshore bank statements proving he is the sole beneficiary of the Cayman accounts Maya instructed. But that black book contains something far more destructive. You need to understand the true scope of this war before you walk into the boardroom tomorrow. I looked down at the dark leather cover. What did he do? He is not just a terrible investor attempting to hide a catastrophic margin call. Maya revealed, her voice slicing through the cold garage air. The Cayman Island debt is an engineered smokescreen. The financial losses are entirely intentional. Julian has been systematically hollowing out the operational valuation of Henry Freight for the past 18 months. My analytical mind stalled. Deliberately crashing the stock price of his own inheritance defied every established rule of corporate self-preservation. Why would he destroy the family empire? I asked. Because he is selling it, Maya answered. She pointed at the black book in my hands. He struck a back-channel deal with Vanguard Logistics, your largest foreign competitor. Vanguard wants your exclusive maritime routes, but Henry Freight was too expensive to acquire on the open market. Julian agreed to sabotage the company from the inside, dropping the valuation to a fraction of its true worth. In exchange, when Vanguard initiates the hostile buyout next month, they are going to grant Julian a hidden executive golden parachute worth $50 million, paid directly into those offshore accounts. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. The embezzlement from the pension fund was not a desperate attempt to cover a foolish mistake. It was a calculated, premeditated mechanism to bankrupt the firm. Julian was selling out our grandfather's proud legacy, trading the livelihoods of thousands of dedicated employees for his own lavish, unearned retirement. But the final crushing blow was yet to fall. Your parents know, Maya stated, delivering the execution order to my lingering familial devotion. I stared at her, the breath turning to frost in my lungs. Richard and Victoria, I whispered, unable to mask the tremor in my voice. They endorsed the strategy, Maya confirmed, her eyes radiating a profound, shared sorrow. Managing Henry Freight requires too much actual labor, and your father is tired. He wants to retreat to a tax haven, but he cannot sell the firm legally without triggering a ruinous capital gains audit and a massive shareholder revolt. Julian presented a painless exit strategy. They steal the pension, crash the stock, and let Vanguard consume the wreckage. But the missing pension funds would still trigger a federal investigation, I argued, grasping at the frayed, burning edges of the conspiracy. Someone has to answer for the $40 million hole when the company is absorbed by the rival firm. Maya looked at me with a devastating, piercing clarity. Yes, she said. Someone does. The rogue risk analyst who supposedly operated a shadow ledger, the unstable daughter who suffered a hysterical breakdown at a public event, the disgraced employee who conveniently signed the proxy authorizations for every single fraudulent wire transfer. The concrete pillars of the parking garage seemed to tilt. The chilling, undeniable truth settled deep into the marrow of my bones. My family had not simply stumbled into a crisis and panicked. They had engineered a grand, devastating betrayal. They built an intricate, lethal trap designed to funnel the company wealth into their own pockets, explicitly intending to sacrifice my freedom to shield their exit. They planned to spend their golden years drinking vintage champagne on a foreign coastline, while I spent the best decades of my life rotting in a federal penitentiary. The final microscopic thread of loyalty I held for my parents snapped. The daughter who yearned for Richard's approval and Victoria's affection died on the freezing concrete of that underground parking structure. I did not cry. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty incinerated any remaining capacity for grief. What emerged from the ashes was a cold, righteous fury, hard and sharp as an Alaskan glacier. I looked at Maya. She recognized the profound shift in my posture, the sudden, quiet stillness that replaces lingering fear with focused intent. Are you ready? Maya asked. I tightened my grip on the black leather book and the thick envelope. The analog dead man switch my grandfather built required irrefutable proof of fiduciary betrayal. I now held the exact blueprints to their entire criminal enterprise. I am going to burn their paradise to the ground, I replied. We did not exchange another word. Maya turned and walked back to her vehicle, slipping into the driver's seat and disappearing up the concrete ramp into the pre-dawn darkness. I returned to my car, tossing the evidence onto the passenger seat next to the discarded corporate legal threats. The sun would rise soon, bringing the dawn of Thursday. I had 24 hours to craft the perfect illusion of defeat. If my family wanted a sacrificial lamb, I would give them one, right up until the exact moment I locked the boardroom doors. I returned to the shabby motel room just as the pale Alaskan sun crested the eastern horizon. The harsh morning light filtered through the frosted window, illuminating the legal documents scattered across the scratchy bedspread. Harrison sat at the small wooden table, drinking a lukewarm cup of black tea. He looked up when I walked through the door. I did not need to speak. I simply placed the thick envelope of offshore bank statements and Julian's black leather ledger onto the mattress. Harrison opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the handwritten columns detailing the Vanguard Logistics buyout conspiracy. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He closed the book and nodded. We possessed the weapon. Now we needed to ensure the target stood perfectly still while we took the shot. To execute the trap flawlessly, I had to lull my family into a false sense of security. My father possessed the cunning instincts of a veteran corporate raider. If I walked into the headquarters displaying an ounce of confidence, Richard would immediately sense the ambush and delay the shareholder vote. I needed to feed his boundless arrogance. I needed to hand him the exact narrative he craved. Harrison and I spent the next hour drafting an electronic message to Gregory Sterling, the lead defense counsel for Henry Freight. We composed the email with surgical precision, deliberately stripping away my usual professional vocabulary. I utilized short, disjointed sentences to mimic panic. I wrote that the pressure of the impending criminal investigation was too heavy to bear. I confessed to feeling overwhelmed, frightened, and entirely out of options. I formally withdrew my demand for the $5 million buyout, stating I would gladly accept the original $50,000 severance package. Furthermore, I agreed to sign the proxy, transferring my equity, and submit my immediate resignation during the Friday morning session, provided the board agreed to seal the fabricated evidence against me. I hovered my finger over the mousepad, staring at the pathetic, groveling text on the screen. It felt toxic to send such a subservient message to the men who planned to destroy my life. But Harrison placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, reminding me that the greatest deceptions require the suspension of pride. I clicked send. The response arrived within 20 minutes. Gregory Sterling replied with a sterile, brief confirmation, stating the board accepted my terms and expected my punctual arrival. 10 minutes after that, my mobile phone chimed with a private text message from Julian. "Smart move," my brother wrote. "See you tomorrow. Try to look presentable." A profound, chilling calm settled over the motel room. The dramatic irony was palpable. Julian and Richard were undoubtedly celebrating in their luxurious corner offices, toasting their effortless victory with expensive champagne. Their unchecked hubris blinded them to the reality of their situation. They assumed they had successfully orchestrated the perfect financial crime, framing the disposable daughter to protect a $50 million golden parachute. They believed the Vanguard acquisition was secure. They thought I was a broken, terrified woman weeping in a cheap hotel. The pacing of my life slowed to a crawl over the next 24 hours, creating an eerie, suspended tranquility before the impending hurricane. I spent Thursday afternoon reviewing the bylaws with Harrison, memorizing every specific statute of the foundational charter until I could recite my grandfather's rules in my sleep. I ate a quiet dinner. I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours, resting my mind for the execution. Friday morning dawned bleak and gray, matching the frigid temperature of the coastal waters. The time for preparation had expired. It was time to assume my disguise. I opened my travel suitcase, bypassing the sharp, tailored power suits I typically wore to executive functions. Those garments projected authority and competence. Today, I needed to project total defeat. I reached into the bottom of the bag and pulled out a beige linen blazer I had packed as an afterthought. It was 2 sizes too large, a remnant from an older wardrobe. Instead of steaming the fabric, I deliberately twisted the sleeves and crumpled the lapels, leaving the garment noticeably wrinkled and unkempt. I stood before the cracked mirror in the motel bathroom. I wore simple black trousers and a plain white blouse beneath the oversized blazer. The baggy clothing swallowed my posture, making my shoulders appear slumped and fragile. I applied zero makeup. The dark circles beneath my eyes, earned from a week of relentless stress, remained prominent. I left my hair pulled back in a loose, messy knot. Staring at my reflection, I saw a woman who looked exhausted, fractured, and entirely ready to surrender her future. The armor of a casualty. Harrison met me in the parking lot. He wore a pristine navy suit, carrying his leather briefcase with grim determination. We drove separate vehicles to the downtown financial district, maintaining the illusion of my isolation until the final possible moment. I parked my sedan in a visitor space outside the towering glass headquarters of Henry Freight. The fog hung low over the street. I walked through the revolving doors, gripping the handle of my battered leather satchel. My heart rate remained remarkably steady. The paralyzing fear that had consumed me on Monday was entirely absent, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of an apex predator hiding in plain sight. Marcus stood behind the security desk. When he saw my wrinkled blazer and pale face, his expression softened into a look of profound, patronizing pity. He silently handed me a temporary visitor badge. 2 towering security guards immediately stepped forward, flanking me on either side. They escorted me toward the executive elevator bank, treating me like a disgraced prisoner marching toward the gallows. We ascended to the top floor in total silence. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling executive suite. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans and expensive leather polish. The guards guided me down the long carpeted corridor toward the primary meeting chamber. I stepped through the heavy double doors into the boardroom. The space was immense, paneled in dark walnut, featuring a panoramic window that overlooked the icy Anchorage harbor. 12 prominent board members sat around a vast oval table, their faces a mixture of disdain and manufactured sympathy. Richard sat at the head of the table, presiding over his domain. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Victoria occupied a plush chair in the corner, acting as a silent observer. She dabbed her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, continuing her theatrical performance of the grieving, heartbroken mother. But it was Julian who captured my attention. My brother reclined in his high-backed leather chair, practically vibrating with unearned triumph. The frantic terror I had witnessed on the terrace days ago was completely gone. He did not pinch or twist the bezel of his platinum Rolex. Instead, he simply rested his hands on the polished wood, admiring the expensive watch face with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He was already spending the foreign buyout money in his head, dreaming of Caribbean islands and untraceable wealth. None of them noticed the subtle weight of the satchel hanging from my shoulder. They only saw the wrinkled blazer and the defeated posture. "Alina," my father said, his voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, benevolent warmth. "Thank you for joining us today. We know this has been an incredibly difficult week for your mental health. The board appreciates your willingness to finally see reason and prioritize the safety of the firm." I did not speak. I kept my gaze lowered, allowing my shoulders to sag even further. I walked slowly toward the single empty chair situated at the far end of the long oval table. The executives watched me with quiet contempt, assuming the battle was already over. The tension in my chest coiled tight, a compressed spring waiting for the release mechanism. The audience in the room believed they were attending a swift, painless surrender. They were blissfully unaware that the knife was already drawn, hidden securely beneath the mahogany surface, pointing directly at their throats. I took my seat, placed my satchel on the carpet, and waited for my father to hand me the pen. The meeting commenced with the sharp rap of Richard Henry tapping his knuckles against the polished walnut table. The ambient chatter of the assembled executives died instantly. The sprawling boardroom, perched on the top floor of the Anchorage headquarters, grew dead silent. Through the panoramic windows, the icy gray waters of the harbor mirrored the frigid atmosphere inside the chamber. 12 prominent board members settled into their high-backed leather chairs. They adjusted their silk ties and smoothed their tailored skirts, preparing for a swift, painless execution of my career. At the far end of the table sat the external auditors from a prestigious accounting firm. They were independent contractors, paid handsomely by Henry Freight to verify our quarterly filings. Beside them sat Gregory Sterling, the lead defense counsel for the family trust. He reviewed his legal notepad with a bored expression, expecting a routine resignation. My father stood at the head of the table. He buttoned his custom charcoal suit jacket, projecting the image of a reluctant savior bearing a heavy burden. He cleared his throat and cast a sorrowful glance in my direction. We gather this morning under deeply unfortunate circumstances. Richard began, his voice echoing across the expansive room. Henry Freight has always prided itself on unity. Our foundational strength relies on unwavering trust between the executive branch and the risk management division. Sadly, that trust has been compromised. Over the past week, we discovered severe financial irregularities originating from an unauthorized shadow ledger. These discrepancies threaten the stability of our enterprise. He paused, letting the fabricated gravity of the situation settle over the board members. Victoria dabbed her dry eyes with a handkerchief in the corner, playing her part flawlessly. Julian reclined in his seat, flashing a smug, self-satisfied smirk. My brother was already imagining his foreign buyout payout, unbothered by the perjury occurring feet away from him. However, we are a family business. Richard continued lowering his tone to convey manufactured mercy. We do not wish to drag this unfortunate breakdown into the public eye. Alina has agreed to step down. She recognizes her errors and has chosen to prioritize the safety of the firm. We have drafted a generous severance package and a proxy agreement transferring her equity back to the Treasury to cover the internal losses. This allows us all to heal and move forward. My father picked up a thick legal document from his folder. He slid it down the long expanse of the walnut table. It glided over the polished wood, coming to rest directly in front of my folded hands. Then he reached into his breast pocket. He withdrew the exact same engraved silver Mont Blanc pen he had used during the World Cup match on Sunday. He placed it carefully beside the proxy document. "Sign it, Alina," he instructed, his voice laced with patronizing warmth. "Let us put this tragedy behind us." The executives watched me with quiet contempt. They saw a broken woman wearing a wrinkled beige blazer and an exhausted expression. They waited for my inevitable surrender. I looked down at the proxy. I stared at the silver pen. The metal surface reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. 5 days ago, this exact demand had paralyzed me with conditioned shame. Today, the sight of the heavy barrel filled me with profound crystalline clarity. The illusion of my defeat had served its purpose perfectly. The targets were gathered. The perimeter was secured. I reached out and placed my fingertips on the cold metal of the Mont Blanc pen. I did not pick it up. I applied a fraction of an ounce of pressure and pushed it forward. The silver barrel scraped across the immaculate walnut finish. The metallic grating sound echoed sharply in the silent boardroom. The pen slid all the way back down the table, bumping gently against my father's coffee cup. "No," I stated. My voice held zero tremor. It was crisp, sharp, and entirely devoid of the fragile panic I had fumed in my emails. Richard blinked. The benevolent mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine confusion. "Alina," he warned, his tone hardening, "we agreed to terms. Do not make this difficult." I dropped the slumped posture. I straightened my spine, pressing my shoulders against the back of the leather chair. The baggy, wrinkled blazer no longer looked like the armor of a casualty. It was camouflage discarded the moment the ambush began. I reached down to the carpet and hoisted my battered leather satchel onto the table. I unzipped the main compartment. Instead of pulling out a resignation letter, I withdrew 5 sleek, perfectly bound legal dossiers. They were thick, heavy, and tabbed with bright red indexing markers. "What are you doing, Julian?" snapped his smug smirk, faltering as he leaned forward in his chair. I ignored my brother. I stood up and slid the first dossier across the table, directing it straight into the hands of the lead external auditor. I slid the second binder to the internal compliance director. I pushed the third one directly to Gregory Sterling. I did not give copies to my father or my brother. They already knew the contents of their own crimes. Gregory Sterling frowned, staring at the red cover. "What is this material?" he asked, touching the binding with cautious hesitation. Before I could answer, the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. Harrison Thorne stepped over the threshold. The Seattle litigator wore a pristine navy suit and carried an aura of predatory menace. He did not ask for permission to enter. He simply walked inside, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy doors, and pulled them shut. The loud, undeniable click of the deadbolt locking echoed through the chamber. "Who the hell are you?" Richard demanded, slamming his palms onto the table. "Security, get in here!" "Security cannot hear you through soundproof doors," Richard Harrison replied, his raspy baritone easily dominating the room. "My name is Harrison Thorne. I represent Alina Henry, and I highly recommend you instruct your legal counsel to open those binders before you say another word on the official record." Harrison walked toward my end of the table, taking a designated stance beside my chair. At exactly 9 o'clock this morning, he announced, checking his wristwatch, "Copies of the dossiers currently sitting in front of your auditors were transmitted to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. A secondary filing was submitted to the Federal Maritime Regulators." The smugness drained from Julian's face in a single, terrifying instant. The color vanished from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly chalk white. He shrank back into his leather chair, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked doors. The millions he had imagined spending in the Caribbean evaporated into thin air. Victoria dropped her silk handkerchief. Her theatrical tears ceased immediately, replaced by wide-eyed, authentic terror. "This is an outrage," Richard shouted, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "This is a private corporate meeting. You have no authority to file baseless claims against this firm. Alina, tell your attack dog to stand down right now." I kept my gaze fixed on my father. "The documents are not baseless, Dad, and the shadow ledger you mentioned in your opening speech does indeed exist, but it does not belong to me." I looked at Gregory Sterling. "Open the dossier, Gregory," I commanded. "Read the first page." The seasoned defense attorney flipped open the heavy cover. His eyes scanned the top sheet. The initial confusion on his face morphed into stark, professional panic. His hands began to tremble as he turned to the second page. "What does it say?" Gregory Richard ordered, his voice wavering for the first time. Sterling did not answer his client. He was too busy reading his own potential disbarment. "Allow me to summarize." I offered, projecting my voice so every executive in the room could hear the execution. Section 1 contains the routing numbers and the incorporation documents for a Cayman Islands shell company. The sole registered beneficiary of that offshore account is Julian Henry. Section 2 contains the compliance scraper logs detailing $40 million in unauthorized wire transfers. The external auditors gasped. One of the accountants dropped his pen. Those transfers, I continued staring directly at Julian, did not originate from operational profit margins. They were siphoned directly from the employee pension trust. My brother stole the retirement funds of the warehouse foreman and the dock workers to cover his catastrophic derivatives trading. "That is a lie," Julian shrieked, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "She signed the proxy authorizations. She is the guarantor." "Yes," I agreed, nodding calmly. "I signed proxies meant to cover minor operational deficits. You took those signatures, isolated the digital authorizations, and appended them to fraudulent pension transfers. It was a very clever frame job, Julian, but you made one fatal error." I turned to the next tab in my own copy of the dossier. "You left a secondary ledger in your home safe." Julian stopped breathing. His jaw fell open. He realized the source of the leak. He knew Maya had breached his fortress. Section 3 contains encrypted internal communications between Julian Henry and the executive board of Vanguard Logistics. I read aloud the crisp syllables cutting through the stagnant air. These emails detail a premeditated conspiracy to artificially crash the valuation of Henry Freight. Julian agreed to sabotage our domestic roots to facilitate a hostile foreign buyout. In exchange, Vanguard promised him a hidden golden parachute worth $50 million. The boardroom erupted. The loyalist executives who had previously sneered at my wrinkled blazer now stared at my father and brother with profound, unfiltered disgust. The realization that their leaders had sold them out for a foreign payday shattered the illusion of family unity. "Stop reading," Richard bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "I am the chief executive of this firm. I order you to stop." I closed the dossier. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The trap had snapped shut. They were locked in a room with their own undeniable treason, surrounded by auditors who were legally obligated to report the findings. The narrative had shifted from my termination to their impending federal indictments. The battle of the evidence was over, but the true legal slaughter, the activation of my grandfather's hidden legacy, was about to begin. Victoria sprang from her plush corner seat, her tailored skirt catching briefly on the armrest. "You ungrateful, scheming liar," she shrieked, her voice shattering the stunned silence of the boardroom. The theatrical sorrow she had wielded moments ago evaporated, replaced by a raw, venomous fury. She pointed a manicured finger across the long walnut table. "Do not listen to her. She is sick. She fabricated these documents to destroy her own blood out of sheer, petty jealousy." I watched my mother unravel. A week ago, that shrill, piercing tone would have triggered a conditioned panic within my chest. Now I felt nothing but a profound clinical detachment. I observed her outburst with the same cool precision I used to analyze a volatile shipping manifest. The executives did not rush to comfort her. They remained frozen in their high-backed chairs, their eyes darting between the hysterical matriarch and the devastating evidence resting in front of the auditors. Gregory Sterling did not look at Victoria. The seasoned defense attorney kept his gaze locked on the red-tabbed dossier. His index finger traced the printed lines of Julian's offshore routing numbers, moving steadily toward the encrypted emails detailing the Vanguard logistics conspiracy. As a veteran of corporate law, Sterling possessed a pristine survival instinct. He calculated the fallout in real time. Defending a routine internal dispute was his job. Shielding executives who had just been reported to the Securities and Exchange Commission for pension theft was a fast track to losing his legal license and facing federal conspiracy charges. Sterling reached out and grasped the edge of his open laptop monitor. With a sharp, definitive click, he snapped the computer shut. He placed both hands flat on the armrests of his leather chair and pushed backward. The casters rolled across the thick carpet, creating a physical gap between himself and my father. Gregory Richards snapped his face flushed with a dark, rising panic. "Tell this room that these documents are inadmissible. Draft an immediate injunction against her." Sterling refused to meet my father's eye. He stared straight ahead at the panoramic window. "I represent the corporate entity of Henry Freight," Richard the attorney stated, his tone deliberately devoid of emotion. "I do not represent your personal criminal defense. Given the severity of the federal filings Harrison Thorne just outlined, my ethical obligations require me to withdraw from advising you on this matter immediately." The defection was a tangible blow. The invisible armor of invincibility surrounding my father began to crack. He looked around the oval table, seeking a sympathetic face among the board members he had handpicked. He found only averted gazes and rigid postures. Cornered and desperate, Richard resorted to the only weapon he believed he still possessed. He relied on brute structural force. He stood up, planting his knuckles firmly onto the polished wood, trying to physically dominate the space. "This is a kangaroo court," Richard declared, his baritone voice trembling with exertion. "I am the chief executive officer of this firm. Regardless of what fabricated nonsense my daughter has compiled, Julian and I hold 60% of the voting equity in the family trust. I maintain structural control." He turned toward the compliance director. "I call for an immediate shareholder vote to expel Alina from these premises, sever her employment with cause, and strip her of her remaining dividends." Harrison Thorne leaned against the locked double doors, crossing his arms over his pristine navy suit. A cold, predatory smile played on his lips. "You cannot call a vote," Richard the Seattle litigator said softly. I reached down to the carpet, sliding my hand into the battered leather satchel one final time. I bypassed the modern digital printouts and grasped the thick, brittle edges of the leather-bound folio. I hoisted the archival artifact onto the table. The faint scent of dried binding glue and aged parchment wafted into the sterile, climate-controlled air. I untied the frayed black ribbon. The cover fell open, revealing the original 1974 Articles of Incorporation. The yellowed pages stood in stark contrast to the sleek laptops and modern tablets surrounding them. "You relied on your New York attorneys to digitize the bylaws," I said, tracing the edge of the fragile paper. "They searched for keywords on modern servers. They ignored the analog history filed under the defunct maritime insurance schedules. They missed the bedrock of the entire enterprise." I turned to the specific addendum. This is the Fiduciary Safeguard Clause, drafted and notarized by Alina Henry. I read aloud, ensuring every syllable echoed clearly across the room. "Any managing trustee or executive officer engaged in fraudulent acts against the Employee Retirement Trust shall immediately and irreversibly forfeit all equity rights and voting privileges within the corporation." Richard scoffed a desperate, breathless sound. An outdated piece of paper from 50 years ago does not supersede the modern digital amendments. Those bylaws were updated. Foundational trust charters supersede all subsequent operational amendments unless legally dissolved by a unanimous shareholder vote. Harrison corrected his legal expertise, slicing through my father's delusion. A vote Alina Henry never permitted before he died. The clause remains active, binding, and lethal. "The statute requires a specific trigger," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Richard. "It dictates that the forfeiture activates the exact moment irrefutable proof of fiduciary betrayal is evidenced to federal regulatory agencies. It cannot be triggered by internal suspicion. It requires an external sworn filing." I checked the digital clock on the boardroom wall, which occurred exactly 17 minutes ago when the SEC timestamped the encrypted files Maya retrieved from Julian's safe. Richard stared at me, the color draining from his face as the legal mechanics of the trap finally computed in his mind. "The genius of my grandfather's design lies in the penalty," I explained, delivering the final crushing blow. "The forfeited shares do not return to the company treasury. They do not trigger a board election. To protect the workers from a corrupt succession, the charter dictates that the disgraced executive's entire equity stake transfers automatically to the remaining compliant trustee." I placed my hand flat over Alina Henry's faded blue signature. "I do not need to persuade these executives to vote you out, Dad. I do not need to win a popularity contest, because as of 17 minutes ago, your 60% evaporated. It transferred to me. I now hold a 65% supermajority." The corporate hierarchy inverted in a single, breathtaking second. The men who had locked me out of the building on Monday were now technically trespassing in my facility. Richard's knees buckled. He collapsed back into his chair, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a hollow wheeze. The impenetrable patriarch was reduced to a broken, powerless spectator. Beside him, Julian was hyperventilating. His chest heaved beneath his expensive designer shirt. The golden child had lost the shipping empire, the legacy, and his prestigious title. Yet a frantic, desperate glint remained in his eye. He was calculating his survival, likely clinging to the belief that even if the company was gone, his Vanguard buyout money and his offshore Cayman accounts were still secured by his airtight prenuptial agreement. He assumed he could still retreat to his luxury estate and hide behind his hidden wealth. He had no idea the Shadow Alliance had prepared a secondary execution, and the architect of his domestic ruin was currently waiting on the other side of the locked boardroom doors. The boardroom air felt stagnant, thick with the scent of ozone and sheer panic. Richard remained slumped in his high-backed chair, a broken patriarch staring blankly at the mahogany grain as his corporate empire dissolved around him. But Julian refused to accept the new reality. The golden child had never been denied a single desire in his entire life. He could not comprehend the concept of a consequence falling upon his own shoulders. Julian kicks his leather chair backward. The heavy piece of furniture tipped over, crashing loudly against the wooden credenza. He stormed toward my end of the long table, his face twisted into a mask of pure, untethered rage. "You think a 50-year-old piece of paper changes who I am?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking under the intense strain. He planted his palms flat on the table, leaning over the red-tabbed dossiers, his breath hot and ragged. His tailored shirt clung to his shoulders, damp with the sudden sweat of primal terror. "I am the true heir to this firm. I am the chief strategy officer. You can hand those files to the authorities, but you will never touch my personal capital." He was clinging to his final psychological raft. Even with the Securities and Exchange Commission preparing to freeze the corporate accounts, Julian believed his personal wealth insulated him from the impending fallout. He assumed his domestic real estate, his luxury vehicles, and his pristine private investment portfolios remained untouchable. He planned to hire his own fleet of defense attorneys, bury the federal investigators in endless procedural delays, and retreat to his sprawling estate while the shipping company burned. He had no idea the Shadow Alliance had already mined his domestic sanctuary. Harrison Thorne stepped away from the heavy double doors at the back of the room. He reached behind his back and turned the brass deadbolt. The lock disengaged with a sharp, echoing snap. He pulled the heavy wooden panels open, letting the cool draft of the exterior corridor sweep into the stifling chamber. Footsteps sounded on the carpet, crisp, rhythmic, and unhurried. Maya walked into the boardroom. My sister-in-law looked transformed. She had discarded the soft pastel dresses Victoria always forced her to wear for high society photo opportunities. Today, she wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit jacket over a crisp white blouse paired with dark trousers. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She did not look like the quiet, submissive wife the Henry family had paraded around Anchorage to soften Julian's ruthless image. She embodied her true identity. She was a top-tier corporate strategist from Chicago, and she had come to collect her severance. Julian straightened up his rage, momentarily derailed by raw confusion. "Maya," he snapped, his tone thick with heavy condescension. "What are you doing here? This is a restricted executive meeting. Go wait in the car." Maya did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze to the floor. She walked past the stunned executives, ignoring Victoria's quiet, terrified sobbing in the far corner. She stopped directly across the table from her husband. When Richard and Gregory Sterling drafted the prenuptial agreement 3 years ago, they engineered it as a gilded cage. The contract contained severe morality clauses and strict financial disclosure mandates. It stipulated that if Maya ever hid assets, engaged in financial deception, or filed for divorce without verifiable legal cause, she would forfeit all spousal support. The Henry men built the document assuming Maya was the inherent risk. They never considered that the cage locked both ways. Maya opened her sleek leather briefcase. She pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope and dropped it onto the center of the walnut table. The packet landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that made Julian flinch. "I am not waiting in the car, Julian," Maya said. Her voice was pitched perfectly, a smooth, icy dagger cutting through the humid tension of the room. "I am initiating the dissolution of our marriage." Julian scoffed, a desperate, hollow sound echoing in his chest. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, trying to project dominance. "You are filing for divorce today," he mocked, attempting to regain his footing. "You picked a terrible time to try and steal my money. You signed the prenup. You walk away with zero. I will tie you up in family court until you cannot afford to feed yourself." Maya smiled. It was a terrifying expression, devoid of any warmth or residual affection. "I am not trying to steal your money, Julian. I am simply enforcing the contract your father wrote." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the thick manila envelope. "Inside that packet is the formal divorce petition," she explained, holding his gaze with unrelenting intensity. "Attached to it is a legally binding addendum. It contains certified copies of the offshore bank statements you hid in your home safe. It outlines the millions of dollars in highly leveraged, toxic debt you accrued in the Cayman Islands without my knowledge or consent. Julian stopped breathing. The smug defiance evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden, sinking horror. He looked from Maya to me, realizing we had orchestrated a synchronized dual-front attack. He had focused all his defenses on the boardroom, leaving his home entirely unguarded. The financial disclosure clause in our prenuptial agreement is ironclad. Maya continued, stepping closer to the edge of the table. It states that any hidden marital liability exceeding $50,000 constitutes a material breach of contract. By concealing the Cayman disaster, you violated the foundational terms of our marriage. You exposed my legal standing to international creditors. The external auditors watched the destruction in stunned silence. Even Gregory Sterling, a man who built his career writing draconian contracts to protect wealthy men, stared at Maya with a mixture of dread and profound professional respect. Because you breached the agreement, Maya said, her crisp syllables ringing out across the frozen boardroom, the penalty phase activates upon discovery. The contract explicitly entitles me to seize your remaining clean assets to offset the hidden liabilities you exposed me to. Julian shook his head, his eyes wide and frantic. "No," he whispered, his voice failing him, reducing him to a raspy plea. "You cannot do that. The domestic accounts are separate." "They were separate," Maya corrected, her tone clinical and unyielding. "Now they are mine. I have already filed the emergency injunctions with the state courts. The primary estate, the domestic investment portfolios, and the luxury vehicles are currently frozen under my exclusive legal control. You are going to leave this building today with the clothes on your back and a platinum watch, and I highly suggest you sell the watch to pay for a criminal defense attorney, because your family no longer possesses the corporate capital to protect you." The destruction was total and undeniable. The golden child who had spent his entire life shielded by unearned wealth and parental favoritism was reduced to utter ruin in a matter of seconds. I had utilized the corporate bylaws to strip him of his professional empire and his impending foreign payout. Maya had weaponized his own domestic contracts to eradicate his personal sanctuary and his remaining wealth. Julian collapsed back into his chair. He did not scream. He did not throw another tantrum or curse our names. He simply stared at the walnut table, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. He resembled a fish pulled from the icy Alaskan harbor and tossed onto the dry, suffocating deck. He was trapped infinitely between the impending federal indictments and an inescapable domestic bankruptcy. Maya did not linger to watch him suffer. She had delivered her strike with flawless execution, severing the toxic ties that had bound her to this family for 3 agonizing years. She fastened the single button of her charcoal jacket, picking up her leather briefcase with calm, steady hands. She turned away from the ruin of her husband and looked down the length of the table toward me. For a fleeting second, the cold corporate masks we both wore slipped away. Maya met my eyes. She offered a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of deep mutual respect. It was a silent acknowledgement of the shadow alliance we had forged in the freezing driveway, a recognition of the sheer endurance required to outmaneuver the men who tried to bury us. I returned the nod, holding her gaze until she turned around. Maya walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking softly against the thick carpet. She did not look back at Julian. She did not look at Victoria weeping in the corner, or Richard staring silently at the floor. She simply walked out the double doors, stepping into her hard-earned freedom. I remained seated at the end of the long table. The external auditors began packing their briefcases, their expressions grim and urgent. They needed to return to their own firm and distance themselves from the impending federal raid before the authorities arrived. The Loyalist executive stood up, avoiding my gaze, and shuffled quickly out of the room, abandoning the sinking ship. The audience had departed. The illusion of the untouchable dynasty was shattered. Only the core remnants of the Henry family remained in the chamber, surrounded by the wreckage of their own boundless greed. I looked at my parents, feeling a strange, hollow calm settling over my chest. The corporate war was won. The domestic battles were finished. Only the final, necessary emotional severance remained. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the retreating executives, sealing the remaining members of the Henry bloodline inside the sterile corporate chamber. Gregory Sterling stood in the far corner, packing his leather briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. The seasoned attorney pressed his mobile phone to his ear, his voice muffled as he urgently requested an emergency consultation with a federal defense firm in Seattle. He did not glance at my father. He merely hoisted his bag over his shoulder, slipped through the exit, and vanished down the carpeted hallway. We were alone. The sprawling boardroom designed to intimidate foreign shipping magnates and union negotiators now served as an isolated holding cell. A jagged, wet gasp shattered the stagnant air. Julian bent forward, burying his face in his trembling hands. The golden child was weeping. The sound was not dignified. It was a high-pitched, ragged sobbing, devoid of any stoic restraint. He rocked back and forth in his high-backed chair, mourning the instantaneous evaporation of his unearned legacy and his hidden Caribbean wealth. His tailored designer shirt, previously a symbol of his untouchable status, now clung to his shoulders, stained with the cold sweat of impending ruin. Richard remained paralyzed at the head of the long walnut table. The patriarch stared at the red-tabbed dossiers scattered across the polished wood, his jaw slack. The realization of his exposed criminal liability crushed the remaining air from his lungs. He possessed no backup plan, no secondary legal maneuver to deploy. The empire was lost, and the federal regulators were already sharpening their knives. But Victoria refused to accept the finality of the execution. My mother pushed herself out of her plush corner seat. She smoothed the front of her ivory skirt, her hands shaking as she attempted to reconstruct her shattered poise. The venomous fury she had unleashed mere minutes ago vanished, replaced by a desperate, cloying vulnerability. She walked around the perimeter of the table, her high heels sinking into the thick carpet, moving purposefully toward my chair. She stopped 3 feet away. The suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me, mingling with the sharp tang of my brother's panic. Victoria reached out her manicured fingers, trembling as she grasped the edge of the table. "Alina," my mother whispered, her voice cracking with manufactured fragility. "Please, look at what is happening to us. This has gone too far." I remained seated, keeping my posture rigid and my hands folded in my lap. I did not shrink away from her proximity. "You proved your point," Victoria continued, tears welling in her eyes and spilling over her dark eyelashes. "You outsmarted your father. You secured the majority share. You won the company. But you cannot hand your own flesh and blood over to the authorities. We are your family. I am your mother." A single dark tear carved a path through her pristine foundation makeup. She reached across the spatial divide, attempting to cover my folded hands with her own. I pulled my arms back, resting my wrists on the arms of my chair, denying her the physical connection she sought to exploit. Victoria withdrew her empty hands, bringing them to her chest in a gesture of profound, theatrical heartbreak. "Julian needs a medical facility, not a prison yard," she pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. "Your father will not survive a federal trial at his age. You hold the power now. You can call the regulators. You can tell them the offshore accounts were a corporate misunderstanding, a complex tax strategy that went awry. We will walk away quietly. We will leave Anchorage, but you must authorize the corporate treasury to cover our legal retainers. We need the company defense fund to handle the incoming inquiries. You must save us." I sat in silence, watching the performance unfold. Decades of psychological conditioning dictated that I should comfort her. My childhood was defined by a desperate yearning to earn her elusive affection. When I was younger, the sight of my mother weeping would have broken my resolve, compelling me to sacrifice anything to dry her tears. But looking at her now, I felt nothing. The emotional emancipation was total and profound. I observed her weeping with the cold, sterile detachment of an external auditor reviewing a deeply flawed spreadsheet. I noted the specific physiological mechanics of her distress. I watched the slight quiver of her lower lip, the rapid blinking meant to generate moisture, the calculated pitch of her vocal fry. It was not genuine sorrow. It was a transactional currency deployed to purchase her own survival. She was weeping for her lost social standing, her vanished wealth, and her impending public humiliation. I refused to look away. I held her gaze, offering zero empathy, zero anger, and zero forgiveness. "You are asking the firm to indemnify your criminal defense," I stated, my tone sharp and entirely clinical. "Yes," Victoria nodded frantically, eager to cling to any semblance of negotiation. "It is standard executive procedure. The director's and officer's liability insurance policy covers internal legal disputes." I shook my head, a slow, deliberate motion. "That insurance policy protects executives who make earnest operational errors." I corrected. "It is instantly voided the moment an officer commits intentional, premeditated fraud against the entity itself. You did not make a mistake, Mother. You and Richard conspired to drain the employee pension trust to facilitate a hostile foreign acquisition. You victimized this corporation." Richard raised his head, his eyes widening as the financial reality of his situation crystallized. "Therefore," I continued, my voice echoing off the paneled walls, "Henry Freight will not release a single cent to shield you from the consequences of your own theft. The corporate treasury is officially closed to you. If you require legal representation, you will have to liquidate your personal assets, assuming, of course, the federal government does not freeze your private accounts before the banks open on Monday." Victoria gasped, stepping backward, as if I had struck her across the face. "You are sentencing us to ruin! How can you be so callous? We gave you life. We raised you." "You raised a shock absorber," I replied, rising slowly from my leather chair. "You groomed a designated scapegoat. You brought me into your study on Sunday and handed me a proxy document that would have chained me to Julian's toxic offshore debt. You drafted sworn affidavits intended to send me to a federal penitentiary for 2 decades, simply to ensure you could retire on a Caribbean shoreline with Vanguard's payout." I stepped around the edge of the table, closing the distance between us. Victoria flinched, shrinking under the intense, unyielding focus of my gaze. "Do not invoke the sanctity of blood right now," I warned, keeping my voice dangerously low. "The family died the exact moment you decided my freedom was the required currency to purchase your golden parachute. You murdered the bond between us when you chose to frame me. I am merely delivering the autopsy report." Richard pushed himself up from his chair, using the edge of the table to support his trembling weight. He looked older, his regal posture collapsing under the weight of total defeat. "Alina," he croaked a pathetic, rasping sound. "Where do we go?" I checked the sleek digital clock mounted above the exit doors. It read 9:45 in the morning. "You have exactly 60 minutes to clear your personal effects from the executive suites," I informed them, establishing the ultimate, unbreakable corporate boundary. "You may take photographs and personal electronics. You will leave all corporate devices, hard drives, and physical files on your desks. If you attempt to delete any internal data, I will add obstruction of justice to the dossier currently sitting on the investigator's desk." Julian ceased his sobbing. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and swollen, his face a portrait of unadulterated shock. "You are throwing us out onto the street," he whispered. At 10:45, I stated, ignoring his disbelief, "The internal security detail will arrive at your respective offices. They will escort you into the elevator, guide you through the main lobby, and walk you out to the visitor parking lot. Your access credentials are permanently revoked. If any of you attempt to enter this facility again, Marcus will call the Anchorage police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing." The decree hung in the frigid air, absolute and irreversible. The power dynamic was forever cemented. I was no longer the quiet analyst hiding in the back office. I was the chief executive of Henry Freight, and I was cleaning house. Victoria covered her mouth with her trembling hand, stifling a final jagged sob. She looked at Richard, waiting for the patriarch to summon some hidden reserve of strength to unleash a final, roaring defense of their dynasty. But Richard possessed nothing left to give. He lowered his gaze to the carpet, a defeated, hollow shell of a man, and turned his back on me. He shuffled toward the heavy double doors, his footsteps dragging across the floor. Victoria followed him, her pristine ivory suit looking suddenly tragic and irrelevant. Julian stumbled out of his chair, grabbing his suit jacket with shaking fingers, his mind fractured by the sheer velocity of his downfall. The three of them walked out of the boardroom in a silent, pathetic procession, leaving the sprawling chamber empty. I stood near the panoramic window, looking out over the icy, turbulent waters of the harbor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, devastating silence. The toxic roots that had strangled this company for a decade were finally severed. I had survived the psychological slaughter, enforced my boundaries, and claimed my grandfather's throne. Now the arduous, solitary task of rebuilding the empire from the ashes awaited me. 6 months later, mid-January in Anchorage delivers a specific kind of brutal weather. The coastal winds howl across the Gulf of Alaska, carrying sheets of freezing rain that coat the harbor in thick layers of solid ice. From the panoramic windows of the top-floor executive suite, I watched the heavy cargo freighters navigate the treacherous gray waters. The winter storm raged outside, pounding against the reinforced glass. But inside, the chief executive office of Henry Freight and Logistics, the atmosphere was warm, quiet, and deeply grounded. The sprawling space looked entirely different than it had half a year ago. On my first official day as the majority shareholder, I ordered the building management team to dismantle my father's imposing mahogany desk and remove it from the premises. In its place, I installed a massive, weathered oak table, salvaged from a maritime storage facility. It was my grandfather's original desk. The wood was scarred with decades of hard use, bearing the authentic marks of a man who built an empire through grueling labor rather than financial deception. Sitting behind it felt like anchoring the corporation back to its rightful moral foundation. The transition of power had been swift and unsparing. The morning after the boardroom confrontation, federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked by maritime regulators, arrived at the headquarters. They seized every hard drive, physical file, and encrypted server tied to my father and brother. The evidence Harrison Thorne and I provided proved impenetrable. Richard and Julian are currently facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage. The presiding judge labeled them a significant flight risk, demanding they surrender their passports and confining them to the Anchorage city limits pending trial. Their social standing within the Alaskan elite, a currency they once valued above all else, evaporated overnight. The Knik Harbor Club revoked their memberships. Former sycophants and loyalist executives refused to return their calls. My father, the once untouchable patriarch, now spends his days sitting in sterile legal waiting rooms, watching his defense attorneys drain the last remnants of his personal savings. Julian suffered a particularly poetic downfall. Maya executed the penalty clauses of their prenuptial agreement with terrifying efficiency. The state courts granted her full control over the domestic estate and the clean investment portfolios, leaving my brother with nothing but his designer suits and a mountain of toxic offshore debt. Deprived of his unearned wealth and his unearned title, the golden child fractured. He currently rents a small, unremarkable apartment near the industrial district, a stark contrast to the Caribbean paradise he attempted to purchase with stolen retirement funds. Victoria faded into the shadows of the city. Stripped of her corporate royal status, my mother resigned from every charity board and high society planning committee. She lives in a quiet suburban condominium, isolated from the glamorous network she sacrificed her own daughter to maintain. I have not spoken to any of them since the moment they walked out of the double doors of the boardroom. The silence between us is permanent, carrying zero guilt and zero regret. A soft chime from the intercom on my oak desk broke my reverie. Marcus, the former lobby guard, whom I recently promoted to head of corporate security, announced my 10 o'clock appointment. "Send her in, Marcus," I instructed, pressing the intercom button. The heavy office doors opened, and Maya stepped into the room. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, carrying her signature leather briefcase. Over the past 6 months, Maya had channeled her formidable intellect into launching her own independent firm, Meridian Strategic Consulting. Unshackled from Julian's fragile ego and the toxic Henry family dynamic, her career skyrocketed. She quickly became the most sought-after corporate advisor in the Pacific Northwest, renowned for her flawless analytical precision and her ruthless negotiation tactics. Henry Freight remains her top client. Maya crossed the thick carpet and took a seat opposite my desk. She did not offer a fragile hug or a forced smile. Our relationship was forged in the crucible of a freezing parking garage built on the solid bedrock of mutual survival and profound professional respect. We operated as equals. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a sleek, bound contract, sliding it across the oak surface. "This is the retainer renewal for the upcoming fiscal year," Maya stated, her tone crisp and businesslike. "I adjusted the structural advisory fees to reflect the new international shipping routes you acquired last month. The liability clauses are ironclad." I picked up the heavy pen resting on my desk, skimming the specific provisions of the contract. "You increased your baseline rate by 15%, I noted, looking up to meet her sharp, intelligent gaze. "Meridian Strategic Consulting delivers premium market foresight," Maya replied, without a trace of hesitation. "We identified the systemic vulnerabilities in Vanguard Logistics, allowing you to counter their hostile takeover attempt and acquire their regional assets at a severe discount. The 15% increase is a bargain, Alina." A genuine smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. I signed the last page of the document with a fluid, confident stroke, pushing the approved contract back across the desk. "The funds will be wired by the end of the business day." Maya placed the document back into her briefcase, snapping the brass clasps shut. She stood up, smoothing the front of her navy jacket. "It is a pleasure doing business with you," she said. "Likewise, Maya. I will see you at the quarterly review next month." She offered that familiar, subtle nod of respect before turning and walking out of the executive suite, the doors clicking softly behind her. I leaned back in my leather chair, pulling the latest financial ledgers from my desk drawer. The pages were filled with crisp, black columns of ink. Under my leadership, the firm had stabilized and flourished. The first action I took as chief executive was to fully restore the employee pension trust, fortifying the accounts with redundant analog security measures that no single executive could ever bypass. The dock workers, the warehouse foremen, and the logistics coordinators retained their life savings. The numbers on the page were no longer a manipulated weapon used to mask a gambling addiction. They were a sacred promise, restored to their original purpose. I closed the ledger feeling a profound sense of closure. The war was officially over. I reached down and unlocked the bottom drawer of the oak desk. Resting inside, isolated from the clean financial reports and the operational manifests, was a single sheet of heavy, expensive paper. It was the original proxy document my father had presented to me in his study on the day of the World Cup final. The signature line remained blank. I picked up the document, feeling the thick grain of the paper between my fingertips. 6 months ago, this single sheet represented a terrifying ultimatum. It symbolized the crushing weight of a family that demanded my total subjugation in exchange for conditional, fabricated love. They expected me to fold. They assumed my loyalty was a permanent, exploitable weakness. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the commercial paper shredder resting near the panoramic window. I did not feel angry as I looked at the proxy. I did not feel sorrow for the parents and the brother I had systematically excised from my life. I fed the heavy document into the narrow slot of the machine. The internal sensors engaged. The steel blades caught the edge of the paper, pulling it downward with a fierce mechanical grip. I stood in the warm, quiet office, listening to the satisfying, steady hum of the motor as it ground the extortion attempt into 1,000 meaningless white ribbons. The proxy vanished into the collection bin, destroyed forever. I turned my gaze back to the towering glass window. Below me, the sprawling Anchorage shipping port operated with relentless, rhythmic efficiency. Massive cranes hoisted cargo containers through the falling snow, securing the vital supply lines that kept the state alive. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of sea salt that always seemed to permeate the harbor air. I was finally free from the conditioned shame and the toxic shadow of my bloodline. I did not just survive their grand betrayal. I weaponized the unvarnished truth, dismantled their criminal architecture, and rebuilt my grandfather's legacy from the ground up. Staring out over the icy empire I now commanded, I understood the true nature of power. It does not stem from unearned titles or offshore wealth. True power lies in recognizing your own intrinsic worth and never again seeking validation from those who only wish to break you. There is a profound, chilling silence that settles over a home when the foundation finally cracks. It is not the loud, shattering noise of a sudden disaster, but the quiet, agonizing groan of wood and mortar giving way after years of invisible rot. When we look at the wreckage of the Henry family empire, the most devastating casualty was never the shipping routes, the offshore bank accounts, or the plummeting stock prices. The true tragedy was the systemic, deliberate destruction of a family unit, a collapse engineered not by external enemies, but by the very people entrusted to protect it. In the landscape of modern American culture, we often blur the lines between family and enterprise. We celebrate the self-made dynasties, the accumulation of wealth, and the relentless pursuit of legacy. The American dream is frequently measured by outward success, the sprawling estates, the prestigious titles, and the effortless projection of perfection. But within the traditional family structure, this pursuit becomes incredibly dangerous when parents begin to view their children not as individuals deserving of unconditional love, but as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. The narrative we just explored is a dark, cautionary mirror, reflecting what happens when the sacred duty of parenting is corrupted by greed, favoritism, and a profound lack of emotional awareness. Consider the creation of the golden child. Julian was not born a fraud. He was meticulously crafted into one by parents who confused enabling with loving. By continually shielding him from the natural consequences of his actions, Richard and Victoria robbed their son of the opportunity to develop resilience, accountability, and a functioning moral compass. In their desperate attempt to protect his unearned status and the family's social veneer, they taught him that rules were flexible, that failure could always be erased with someone else's signature, and that his worth was entirely tied to his title. They built a fragile narcissist who eventually tore down their own house. This is the profound danger of unbalanced parenting within a society that often rewards the appearance of success over the substance of character. When we remove accountability from a child's life, we do not protect them from the world. We leave them utterly defenseless against their own worst impulses. On the opposite end of this toxic spectrum stood Alina, the designated shock absorber. Her journey forces us to confront the agonizing reality of conditional love. For 28 years, she was taught that her value to the family was strictly transactional. Her intelligence, her loyalty, and her tireless work ethic were never celebrated for what they were. They were merely harvested to subsidize her brother's catastrophic failures. It is a heartbreaking dynamic that exists in far too many households across the country, where one child is expected to sacrifice their peace, their boundaries, and sometimes their very future to maintain a manufactured family peace. We teach our children to be strong, to be independent, but often the strongest children are the ones carrying the heaviest, most invisible burdens placed upon them by their own parents. True family responsibility requires profound emotional awareness. It demands that parents look at their children and see them clearly, not as extensions of their own egos, not as tools to fix a problem, but as human beings who need a foundation of emotional safety. When a parent weaponizes a child's natural biological desire for affection, it is a betrayal of the deepest trust. It creates a psychological wound that can take a lifetime to heal. American culture champions self-reliance, but true independence must be nurtured in a garden of fairness and honesty. When the soil is poisoned by manipulation, the child must eventually uproot themselves just to survive. This brings us to the ultimate lesson hidden within the dusty analog archives of Alina Henry's legacy. The grandfather did not just build a shipping company, He built a philosophy rooted in traditional, enduring values. He understood that wealth without integrity is merely a ticking time bomb. Elias represented the core tenets of responsible guidance, honesty, fairness, and the unwavering commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves. He knew that you cannot control the choices your children will make after you are gone, but you can build structural and moral boundaries to limit the damage they might cause. He left behind a failsafe built on truth. As parents, as guides, and as the architects of the next generation, our greatest inheritance is never financial. It is the ethical framework we instill in our children. It is teaching them that true power does not come from crushing others or hiding behind fabricated narratives, but from standing firmly in the cold, unvarnished truth. It is showing them that boundaries are not acts of war, but necessary acts of self-preservation. When we fail to teach these lessons, when we prioritize the preservation of a toxic public image over the emotional well-being of our children, we risk losing them forever. Alina did not walk away because she hated her family. She walked away because her family gave her no other choice if she wanted to survive. The emotional emancipation we witnessed is both triumphant and deeply tragic. There is a resounding victory in severing toxic ties and reclaiming one's life. But there is also a quiet, lingering grief for the family that could have been, if only the parents had been brave enough to be honest with themselves. This story challenges us to look inward, to examine the roles we implicitly assign within our own homes, and to ask ourselves difficult questions about the nature of our own love. Are we fostering environments where our children feel safe to fail, safe to speak the truth, and safe to be authentically themselves? Or are we, in small, unnoticed ways, asking them to carry burdens that are not theirs to bear? If these questions resonate with you, if you find yourself fascinated by the intricate, often hidden dynamics that shape our lives, our relationships, and our sense of self, then I invite you to join our community. Please take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel. Edana Told Stories. Here, we continue to explore the profound, the heartbreaking, and the triumphant narratives that define the human experience. Share your thoughts, your own experiences in the comments, and become part of a conversation that seeks to understand the complex tapestry of family and survival. As the winter wind howls outside and the lights dim in the empty rooms of our past, we are left to ponder the spaces we inhabit. A house is built with timber and glass, but a home is constructed entirely of trust. When that trust is broken, the structure may remain standing, but the warmth is gone forever. We all carry the intricate blueprints of our childhood into our adult lives, tracing the faded lines of old promises and unspoken expectations. But perhaps the greatest realization we can ever achieve is that the pen is ultimately in our own hands. We have the power to cross out the toxic narratives. We have the authority to rewrite the rules of engagement. And sometimes, as we sit in the quiet aftermath of a storm we did not start but had to finish, we realize that the truest family we will ever know is the one we courageously build for ourselves in the clearing left behind.